good evening, or good morning, or whatever hour you find yourself awake when the world has decided not to answer back. This is a late-night broadcast, meant for those who can't sleep, or those who sleep too lightly to feel safe doing so. Tonight's stories are not about monsters that leap from the dark. They are about the quiet rules we learn too late, the moments when we interrupt something that was already in motion, the steps we count without knowing why, the bargains we don't realize we've accepted until the cost is due. Each story you're about to hear takes place in an ordinary place: a theater, a stairwell, a road, a graveyard, a forest, a relic, a monastery. Places you might pass through without thinking. Places that don't look dangerous until they notice you. Listen carefully, not for jump scares, not for answers. Listen for patterns, for the feeling that something is waiting for you to make a small mistake, to stand in the wrong place, to ask the wrong question, to believe you're still in control. Dim the lights if you can, settle in, and remember, just because something doesn't speak doesn't mean it isn't listening. Do not block the view. I don't remember deciding to go into the theater, only the moment when the cold air swallowed me and the city noise fell away behind a heavy glass door that closed without a sound, sealing me inside a place that smelled faintly of dust, damp carpet, and something sweet that had gone stale a long time ago, like popcorn butter that had soaked into the walls and never quite left. My head was still light from the drinks I'd had earlier, not drunk, not sloppy, just enough that the edges of things felt slightly rounded, as if the world had been smoothed down with fine sandpaper, and I remember thinking that the fog outside had followed me in, clinging to my clothes, my hair, the back of my throat, because my breath felt thicker here, heavier, each inhale carrying a faint chill that didn't match the season. The lobby was dim, lit by a few flickering bulbs that buzzed softly overhead, and somewhere deeper inside the building I could hear the rhythmic clatter of an old projector warming up, that mechanical cough and whir that sounded like a tired animal clearing its throat before settling into a long, repetitive task. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, swaying slightly, reading a faded poster on the wall that advertised a film I'd never heard of, the faces on it blurred by age and moisture, their eyes rubbed almost completely away. And then I followed the sound of the projector through a narrow hallway and into the main screening room, where the darkness closed around me so completely that it took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust, for the rows of seats to separate themselves from the shadows. There weren't many people inside, maybe a dozen at most, scattered loosely throughout the theater, sitting alone or in pairs, all facing forward, all very still, and the screen at the front glowed with a soft, grainy light, already rolling through images without any opening credits, as if I'd arrived in the middle of something that had started long before I got there and would continue long after I left. I chose a seat somewhere in the middle, not too close, not too far, letting myself sink into the worn upholstery that gave way under my weight with a tired sigh, and for a few minutes I let myself relax, letting the steady click-click-click of the projector and the low murmur of indistinct dialogue from the film wash over me, my thoughts drifting in and out, the way they do when you're tired but not ready to sleep yet. That was when I became aware of the woman sitting in the row directly in front of me, centered almost perfectly between my eyes and the screen, her silhouette cutting into the image like a dark stain that refused to dissolve. And at first I thought nothing of it, just a mild, irrational irritation that flared up and then settled again. The kind of thing you feel and immediately tell yourself to ignore, because it's petty and childish to be annoyed by another person's head in a nearly empty theater. But the longer I watched, the harder it became to ignore her, not because she was especially tall or because she moved too much, but because she didn't move at all, not even when the light from the screen shifted dramatically, not even when the film jumped suddenly from a bright outdoor scene to something dark and close, the flicker of the projector tracing sharp lines across the back of her head without her reacting in any visible way. Her hair was long and very black, falling straight down her back like a heavy curtain, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, and I found myself staring at it instead of the movie, noticing how unnaturally still it was, how it didn't sway or ripple, even when someone a few rows down shifted in their seat and the air moved faintly through the room. I tried leaning to the left, then to the right, testing different angles. But no matter how I adjusted myself, her head seemed to remain exactly where it needed to be to block the most important part of the screen, the focal point of every shot, as if it were somehow aware of my line of sight and intent on staying directly in it. The irritation sharpened into something more focused, more uncomfortable, and I became acutely aware of my own body again, the way my jaw felt tight, the way my fingers curled and uncurled against the armrests, the faint sheen of sweat at the base of my neck despite the cold air, and I told myself, again and again, that I was overreacting, that it was just the alcohol and the unfamiliar place and the late hour making me sensitive. Somewhere nearby, someone crunched loudly on popcorn, the sound wet and exaggerated in the quiet, and a few seats over a man cleared his throat, a deep, rattling sound that went on a little too long before stopping abruptly, as if cut off mid-breath, and I remember thinking that the acoustics in the room were strange, that every small noise felt too close, too intimate, like it was happening right next to my ear. I leaned forward slightly, just enough to peer around the woman's head, and for a brief moment I caught a glimpse of the film again, a close-up of a face, pale and expressionless, filling the screen, and then the woman shifted, just a fraction of an inch, and the image was gone, replaced once more by the unbroken darkness of her hair. Something inside me snapped then, not violently, not dramatically, but with the quiet, brittle feeling of a thin thread finally giving way, and before I could overthink it, and before I could talk myself out of it, I leaned forward again and spoke, keeping my voice low, polite, almost apologetic, because that's how you're supposed to handle these things, even when you're annoyed, even when your patience is fraying at the edges. "Hey," I said softly, and my voice sounded oddly flat in my own ears, swallowed up by the space between us. "Sorry, but could you move your head a little? You're kind of blocking the view." For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt a familiar flush of embarrassment creeping up my neck, that awful sense that I'd broken some unspoken rule, that I'd drawn attention to myself in a place where everyone else was content to remain invisible, and I was just about to lean back and pretend I hadn't said anything when the woman spoke. Her voice low and calm and close enough that it made the fine hairs on my arms lift all at once. "Am I?" she asked, and there was something odd about the way she said it. Not defensive, not confused, but genuinely curious, as if the idea had never occurred to her before, as if the concept of being in someone's way was entirely new. I swallowed and nodded, even though she couldn't see me, my mouth suddenly dry, and said, "Yeah, just if you don't mind." She was quiet again for a few seconds, long enough that I started to feel that creeping unease return, the sense that time had stretched and thinned in that small gap of silence. And then she spoke once more, tilting her head just slightly to one side, not enough for me to see her face, but enough that I could tell she was thinking about something. "In your way," she repeated slowly, tasting the words, rolling them around as if they were unfamiliar. And the projector hummed on. The film continued to play. The popcorn crunching resumed somewhere behind me, all the ordinary sounds of a late-night screening carrying on as if nothing strange was happening at all. And yet I felt a knot tightening in my stomach, a deep, instinctive warning that had nothing to do with logic or reason, only with the simple, animal knowledge that something had shifted, that a line had been crossed. I opened my mouth to respond, to clarify, to laugh it off and say it wasn't a big deal, that I could move seats if it was easier. But before I could say anything, the woman asked, very quietly, very evenly, "If I move, what will you see?" The question caught me off guard, sharp and unexpected, and for a split second my mind went blank, my thoughts skidding uselessly against each other, because it wasn't what I'd expected her to ask, not at all. And I hesitated, searching for an answer that felt right, that felt safe. And in that hesitation, the darkness around us seemed to deepen, the edges of the theater dissolving into shadow, the steady mechanical rhythm of the projector growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was inside my chest, clicking away in time with my heartbeat. "The movie," I said finally, forcing a small, awkward laugh that sounded thin and unconvincing even to me. Just the screen. She didn't respond right away, and when she did, her voice was even closer than before, so close that I could almost feel the vibration of it against my skin. "That's what you think," she said, and then she went quiet again, her head still perfectly centered in my view, perfectly still, and I realized, with a slow, creeping dread that settled deep into my bones, that I no longer had any interest in the film at all, that I couldn't remember what it was about or why I'd come here in the first place, because all of my attention was fixed on the space between me and the woman in front of me, on the unspoken tension hanging there, thick and heavy, and on the sudden, overwhelming certainty that whatever happened next, whatever she chose to do or not do was going to matter, far more than anything playing on the screen. I became aware of how close she was when I realized I could smell her. Not in the obvious way you expect when someone is sitting directly in front of you, no perfume, no shampoo, but something subtler and more unsettling, a faint, mineral dampness like rain-soaked concrete or the inside of a cellar that hasn't been opened in years. And once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it, each breath drawing it deeper into my lungs until it seemed to settle there, cool and heavy, making it slightly harder to breathe. I tried to shift back in my seat, to create a little more distance between us, but the row behind me was empty and silent, and somehow felt farther away than it should have been, as if the darkness there had weight, as if leaning back into it would mean sinking into something that might not let me come back out. The woman in front of me didn't move, didn't turn, didn't give any indication that she was aware of my discomfort beyond the fact that her question still hung in the air between us, unresolved, pressing down on my thoughts, and I found myself replaying it again and again. If I move, what will you see? As though it were a riddle I was supposed to solve, something with a correct answer and a terrible consequence if I chose wrong. On the screen, the film continued to unfold, but it had lost all coherence for me. Scenes bled into each other without context. Faces appeared and disappeared before I could register them, and the sound felt slightly out of sync, dialogue lagging just a fraction of a second behind the movement of lips. Enough to be noticeable, enough to make my skin prickle with unease. I told myself this was just my imagination, that the alcohol and the late hour and the unfamiliar environment were combining to play tricks on my perception. But even as I thought it, I noticed that the other people in the theater hadn't reacted to the oddness at all, hadn't shifted or murmured or shown any sign that they were experiencing the same subtle wrongness I was, and that isolation, being the only one who seemed to feel it, made everything sharper, more intense. The popcorn crunching behind me stopped abruptly, replaced by a slow, deliberate chewing sound that went on for far too long without another handful being taken, and somewhere to my left, a woman let out a quiet, breathy laugh that didn't seem to correspond to anything happening on the screen, a laugh that rose and fell once and then cut off as if someone had pressed a switch. I leaned forward again despite myself, drawn by a mix of irritation and a growing, inexplicable need to see the woman's face, to confirm that she was normal, that she was just another late-night moviegoer with bad theater etiquette. And as I did, the space between us seemed to shrink in a way that didn't make sense, my knees brushing the back of her seat sooner than I expected, the distance collapsing as though the row itself had shortened while I wasn't looking. My heart began to beat faster, not in a sudden rush, but in a slow, deliberate way, each thump heavy and pronounced, and I became acutely aware of the sound of my own breathing, a little too loud in my ears, a little too fast, and I wondered, not for the first time, if she could hear it too. "I just want to watch the movie," I said quietly, more to myself than to her, the words slipping out before I could stop them, and for a moment I thought she hadn't heard me, but then she tilted her head again, that same slight, thoughtful angle, and spoke in a tone that suggested she'd been listening very carefully the entire time. "You're already watching," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, no amusement, just a simple statement of fact that made my stomach drop because I couldn't immediately tell what she meant by it. I swallowed and tried to laugh it off, tried to inject some normalcy back into the situation, but the sound came out wrong, brittle and short, and died in my throat almost as soon as it began. "Look," I said, keeping my voice low, aware on some level that I was breaking another unspoken rule by continuing the conversation, by insisting on engagement when everything in the room seemed to be urging silence. "It's not a big deal. I can move. I gestured vaguely toward the empty seats to my right, then froze when I realized that they weren't empty anymore. Not in the way they had been before. People sat there now, close together, their outlines barely distinguishable in the low light, their faces turned toward the screen, and I was certain, absolutely certain, that they hadn't been there a moment ago. The certainty hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs, and I sat back hard in my seat, my pulse hammering, my thoughts scrambling for a rational explanation that refused to come. The woman in front of me seemed to sense the shift in my attention, because she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost gentle, as if she were trying to reassure a nervous child. "It's easier if you stay," she said. "Less confusion that way." The word confusion echoed in my head, reverberating strangely, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to get out of the theater, to push past the heavy doors and back into the fog and the noise and the reassuring chaos of the city. But the idea of standing up, of drawing attention to myself, felt impossibly daunting, as though my limbs had grown heavier, my joints stiff and resistant. I tested my fingers again, curling them into fists and then releasing them, reassured only slightly by the fact that they still obeyed me, that I hadn't lost control completely, and I leaned to the side once more, trying to see around the woman's head, desperate now for any glimpse of the screen, any familiar anchor to reality. And this time, she didn't shift to block my view. Instead, the image on the screen changed, resolving into something so unexpected, so intimately familiar, that my breath caught painfully in my chest. It was the theater itself. The same rows of seats, the same dim lights, the same woman sitting directly in front of the camera, her back to the lens, her hair falling in that same unnaturally still curtain, and as I stared, frozen, the image began to move forward, gliding smoothly down the aisle toward the seat where I was sitting, closer and closer, until I could see the back of my own head in the frame, could recognize the slope of my shoulders, the way I leaned slightly to one side, and a wave of cold dread washed over me as I realized that whatever I was watching now was no longer a film at all, but a reflection, a repetition, something looping back on itself in a way that made my skin crawl. "Do you see?" the woman asked quietly. And this time, when she spoke, her voice didn't come from in front of me, but from all around me, from the walls, the ceiling, the seats themselves, layered and close and inescapable, and I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to move, to do something. But when I opened them again, the screen was dark, the image gone, and the woman's head was once again perfectly centered in my view, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if the last few moments had been nothing more than a trick of my tired, overstimulated brain. I sat there, shaking, my mouth dry, my thoughts in disarray, trying to convince myself that I was still in control, that I could stand up and leave at any moment if I chose to. And it was only when the woman leaned back slightly, just enough that I felt the brush of her hair against my knuckles resting on the armrest, a light, deliberate contact that sent a jolt of revulsion through me, that I understood how wrong I'd been, because in that brief, horrifying touch, I felt not softness, but weight, a strange, dragging heaviness that lingered on my skin long after she'd pulled away. And I knew, with a clarity that cut through every excuse and rationalization I'd been clinging to, that whatever was sitting in front of me was not concerned with blocking my view at all, but with making sure I stayed exactly where I was, watching, waiting, and slowly losing my sense of where the screen ended and my own reflection began. The moment her hair brushed my knuckles, I pulled my hand back as if I'd touched something hot, my skin prickling with a delayed, crawling sensation that didn't fade the way it should have, and I tucked my fingers into my lap, curling them tight, pressing my nails into my palms just to feel something solid and familiar. The woman straightened again, resuming that perfect, unbearable stillness, and the space between us seemed to hum faintly, charged with the tension that made my teeth ache. I tried to focus on my breathing, slow in, slow out, the way I'd been taught during panic attacks in the past, counting silently, grounding myself in the physical reality of the seat beneath me, the armrests, in the floor, but each breath felt slightly off, as though the air itself had thickened, resisting my lungs, and the smell I'd noticed earlier grew stronger, that damp mineral scent deepening into something darker, almost metallic, like old coins left too long in water. On the screen, the film resumed without explanation, but the images no longer looked like a story. They were fragments now, disconnected shapes and movements that didn't quite add up to anything recognizable, and the sound had dropped to a low, indistinct murmur, as if the dialogue were being spoken from another room, filtered through walls and distance. I glanced around the theater, my eyes darting from one shadowy figure to the next, searching for any sign of normal human behavior, someone shifting in their seat, someone checking their phone, someone reacting to the strange quiet, but the other audience members sat motionless, their faces turned forward, their outlines rigid and wrong, like mannequins arranged to resemble a crowd. A sudden, irrational thought struck me then, sharp and unwelcome. What if they aren't watching the same thing I am? The idea took root immediately, spreading through my mind with alarming speed, and I imagined the screen as a kind of mirror that showed each of us something different, something tailored and specific, something we were meant to see alone, and the notion made my stomach churn. The woman in front of me shifted for the first time in what felt like hours, rolling her shoulders slightly, as if easing a stiffness, and when she spoke again, her voice was closer than ever, low and steady, threaded with a strange, almost tender patience. "You're uncomfortable," she said, not as a question, but as an observation, and I clenched my jaw, my pulse pounding, unsure how to respond, unsure if responding at all was a mistake. "I just want to watch the movie," I repeated weakly, clinging to the phrase like a lifeline, even though it felt increasingly hollow, stripped of any real meaning. She made a soft sound then, something between a hum and a sigh, and leaned forward slightly, her head dipping just enough that the top edge of the screen became visible again, a thin band of light flickering above her crown, and relief surged through me so suddenly it was almost painful. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought that was the end of it, that she'd finally understood that this strange, oppressive exchange would dissolve back into the background noise of the theater. But then she spoke, and her words landed with the slow, crushing weight of inevitability. "I can move," she said, and my chest tightened, anticipation and dread tangling together. "But you have to be specific." I frowned, confusion cutting through my fear just enough to sharpen it. "Specific about what?" I asked, my voice barely audible, and she turned her head just a fraction more than before, enough that I could see the curve of her cheek, pale and smooth in the dim light, her skin stretched too taut, as if pulled tight over something that didn't quite fit beneath it. "What you want me to move?" she said gently, and the words sent a shiver down my spine, because suddenly there were too many possible answers, too many ways to misunderstand, too many things that could go wrong. I hesitated, my mind racing, and in that hesitation, the theater seemed to lean in around us, the walls pressing closer, the ceiling lowering imperceptibly, the darkness thickening until it felt like a physical presence at my back. "Your head," I said finally, forcing the words out past the knot in my throat. "Just your head." The woman was quiet for a long moment, and I had time to regret my choice, to replay it in my mind, analyzing every inflection, every possible interpretation, and then she nodded once, slow and deliberate. "All right," she said, and raised her hands. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing, my brain refusing to process the image in front of me, because her hands moved not to the back of the seat or to her hair, but to the sides of her head, her fingers spreading wide, sinking into that curtain of black as if it offered no resistance at all. The sound came first, a wet, fibrous tearing noise that cut through the quiet of the theater with horrifying clarity, followed by a dull, internal crack that echoed in my skull, and my breath hitched painfully as I realized, too late, what she was doing. She pulled. There was no struggle, no sign of effort. Her hands moved with calm, practiced precision, and as she tugged, her head separated from her neck in a way that was both abrupt and grotesquely smooth, skin and muscle parting with a sound like thick fabric being ripped in half, followed by a slow, sticky drip that pattered softly onto the floor below. I stared, frozen, my mind screaming in disbelief. As she lifted her head free and held it in her hands, her face still turned away from me, her hair still hanging straight and heavy, and for a sickening moment, I thought that was all there was to it, that the horror lay solely in the impossibility of what I was witnessing. Then the head turned. Her face was not what I expected, not twisted or monstrous, not contorted with pain, but disturbingly calm, her expression neutral, almost polite, her eyes dark and unblinking as they met mine, and when she spoke, her voice came from both the mouth in her hands and the open, ruined column of her neck, layered and echoing in a way that made my vision blur. "Is this better?" she asked, and I felt something inside me fracture, a deep, instinctive understanding that I had crossed into a place where ordinary rules no longer applied, where words had consequences I couldn't predict or control. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The theater erupted into motion around us then, the other audience members finally stirring, but not in the way I'd hoped, heads tilted at unnatural angles, arms lifted and dropped with boneless grace, and as they shifted, parts of them began to come away as if loosely attached, an eyeball popping free with a soft, wet plop and rolling down the aisle, a hand slipping from a wrist and thudding dully against the floor, a head detaching and bouncing once before coming to rest between the seats. And the sounds of it, those awful, intimate sounds, filled the room, overlapping and multiplying until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Panic surged through me at last, hot and overwhelming, shattering my paralysis, and I lurched to my feet, knocking my knees against the seat in front of me, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might tear its way out of my chest. The woman's body slumped forward, headless and strangely small, her hands still clutching that severed face, and I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I turned and ran, stumbling down the aisle as the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet, dodging dismembered limbs and rolling eyes. The theater alive now, with movement and sound, with whispers and wet impacts, and a low, collective murmur that rose and fell like a tide. I reached the exit in a blind rush, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled for the door, and when I finally burst through it, the cold night air slammed into me with enough force to steal my breath, the fog outside wrapping around me like a damp shroud as I staggered out onto the sidewalk. The sounds of the theater cutting off abruptly behind me as the door swung shut, leaving only the distant hum of traffic and my own ragged breathing to fill the silence. I didn't stop running until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, and even then, even crouched there on the pavement, my head spinning, my hands shaking uncontrollably, I couldn't shake the image of that calm, questioning face held in those steady hands, or the certainty that I'd answered her wrong, that whatever I'd unleashed inside that theater wasn't finished with me yet. The fog outside didn't behave like weather so much as a residue, clinging to me as I staggered down the block, my shoes scuffing wet concrete, my breath tearing in and out of my chest in short, panicked bursts that scraped my throat raw. Streetlights hovered overhead like distant moons, their halos smeared by moisture, each pool of light bleeding into the next so that the street felt longer than it should have been, stretched thin, unwilling to let me reach any clear edge. I bent forward with my hands braced on my knees, retching dryly, my stomach heaving even though there was nothing left to come up, and when I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, I noticed it was shaking violently, the tremor running all the way up my arm and into my shoulder. "Get it together," I told myself, over and over, clinging to the sound of my own thoughts as proof that I was still here, still intact, that whatever had happened in that theater had stayed behind those heavy doors, sealed up with the darkness and the noise and the impossible sight of bodies coming apart like badly assembled props. I forced myself upright and started walking again, slower now, my legs unsteady but moving, counting my steps, grounding myself in the rhythm of it left, right, left until the city began to reassert itself in small, familiar ways. The distant wail of a siren, the low hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the muted glow of a convenience store a block away. Each normal sound felt like a fragile anchor, something I could grab onto to keep from drifting back into that place, and for a few precious minutes, it almost worked. I reached the corner and stopped at the curb, waiting for the light to change, my reflection wavering in the dark glass of a closed shop window, and I avoided looking at it directly, afraid of what I might see if I did, afraid that the afterimage of that calm, severed face would still be there, superimposed over my own. When the walk signal finally flickered on, I stepped into the crosswalk and froze. For just an instant, the street ahead of me seemed to narrow, the buildings on either side leaning inward, their windows dark and blank, and the sound of the projector surged back into my ears, that relentless click, 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 syncing perfectly with the rapid thud of my heart. I squeezed my eyes shut and shook my head hard, the way you do when you're trying to dislodge a stubborn thought. And when I opened them again, the street was normal, wide and empty, the fog thinning as it drifted toward the river. I crossed quickly, my pulse still racing, and told myself that trauma did this, that the brain, desperate to make sense of something senseless, replayed it in fragments and echoes, that I would calm down if I just kept moving, if I got somewhere safe and bright and ordinary. I walked for what felt like a long time without really knowing where I was going, turning corners at random, guided only by the instinct to put distance between myself and the theater, and eventually the streets grew quieter. The storefronts fewer, the buildings older and more anonymous, their facades worn smooth by decades of neglect. I became aware, gradually, of another sound layered beneath the city noise, faint at first and easy to dismiss the soft, rhythmic squeak of footsteps behind me, slightly out of sync with my own. I slowed. The sound slowed too. I sped up, my breath hitching, and it followed, maintaining that same subtle lag, close enough to be intentional, far enough back that I couldn't quite place it. A prickle of dread crawled up my spine, and I told myself not to look, not to give in to the urge, because looking would make it real, because looking would mean acknowledging that whatever I'd run from hadn't stayed behind after all. But the longer I walked, the more the sense of being followed pressed in on me, heavy and undeniable, until it felt like a physical weight between my shoulder blades, urging me forward, herding me along a path I hadn't chosen. I ducked into a narrow side street, my shoes splashing through shallow puddles, and glanced back over my shoulder and saw nothing. The alley behind me was empty, stretching away into fog and shadow, its brick walls slick with moisture, its dumpsters silent and still, and I let out a shaky laugh, the sound too loud in the confined space, relief and embarrassment tangling together as my fear momentarily deflated. See, I thought, you're alone. I turned back toward the street ahead and stopped short, my heart slamming painfully against my ribs. At the far end of the alley, partially obscured by fog, stood a figure facing away from me, their posture unmistakably familiar, shoulders slightly hunched, head held at that same faint, thoughtful angle. Black hair fell straight down their back, unmoving despite the damp breeze that stirred the fog around it, and the distance between us felt suddenly fragile, as though it could collapse without warning. I took a step back, my heel catching on uneven pavement, and the figure spoke without turning, their voice low and even, carried clearly through the mist. "You didn't answer me," she said, and the words sent a cold shock through my system because there was no mistaking that voice, no way to rationalize it as coincidence or imagination. My mouth opened, but no sound came out, my throat locking up as my thoughts scattered uselessly, and I stood there shaking, acutely aware of how alone the alley was, how far away the main street suddenly seemed. I moved. She continued calmly, as if resuming a conversation that had only been briefly interrupted. "Just like you asked." The figure took a small step forward, and the light shifted just enough that I could see her silhouette more clearly. And that was when I noticed what was wrong with it, what made it subtly, horribly incorrect. Her head was there, resting on her shoulders, but it sat too low, as if it had been set back into place carelessly, and the line where it met her neck was obscured by a dark band that caught the light with a dull, wet sheen. I stumbled back another step, my stomach twisting, and finally found my voice, thin and unsteady. I didn't mean," she turned then, slowly, deliberately, and the fog parted just enough to reveal her face, or what passed for it now, the features blurred and indistinct, as though they were being viewed through a layer of warped glass, the eyes dark hollows that seemed to look past me rather than at me. "Meaning doesn't matter," she said gently. "Position does." The alley seemed to stretch again, the distance between us elongating and compressing at the same time, and I became aware, with a sinking dread, that the walls on either side were closer than they had been moments ago, the space narrowing, funneling me toward her, toward that wrong, patient stillness. I turned and ran, panic surging anew, my feet slipping on wet stone as I bolted back toward the street, toward the lights and the noise and the promise of other people, and behind me, I heard her footsteps quicken, no longer lagging, no longer out of sync, but matching my pace exactly, each step landing where mine had been a heartbeat before. I burst out of the alley and into the open street, gasping, my lungs on fire, and nearly collided with a passerby who swore loudly and stumbled aside, his presence so sudden and solid that it felt unreal. I spun around, searching frantically for the woman, for any sign of pursuit, and found nothing. The alley mouth yawned behind me, empty and unremarkable, the fog drifting lazily across it, the city humming on as if nothing had happened, and people moved past me without a second glance, their faces tired and ordinary, their bodies intact. My knees buckled, and I sank down onto the cold sidewalk, my head in my hands, trying to piece together what was real and what wasn't, trying to convince myself that I was safe now, that whatever had followed me had finally let go. It was only when someone stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the scuffed toes of their shoes inches from my face, and spoke in a rough, impatient voice that scraped against my nerves, that the last of my fragile composure shattered. "Move," the voice said. "You're in my way." For a moment, I didn't understand the words. Not really, because my mind was still tangled up in the alley and the fog and the sound of footsteps that matched my own too perfectly, and I stayed there on the sidewalk with my head bowed, staring at the scuffed shoes in front of me as if they belonged to a mannequin, an object placed deliberately in my field of vision. The voice came again, closer this time, edged with irritation rather than threat, and that familiarity, the casual impatience of it, was somehow worse than shouting would have been. "Hey," it said, "move. You're blocking the view." My stomach dropped, a slow, nauseating descent, and I forced myself to look up. The man standing over me was unremarkable in every possible way, middle-aged, tired, his coat damp with fog, his face lit unevenly by the streetlight behind him, and for a split second, relief flooded me so hard my vision blurred, because this was just a person, just another stranger annoyed by someone sitting where they shouldn't, just a normal, everyday interaction reclaiming its place in the night. I scrambled to my feet, muttering an apology, my hand shaking as I stepped aside, careful to give him plenty of space, my body remembering the lesson it had learned far too well. He walked past without another word, his footsteps receding down the sidewalk, and I stood there breathing hard, my heart still racing, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something else to go wrong. Nothing did. The street remained stubbornly, infuriatingly normal, the fog thinning as it drifted away, the city resuming its quiet late-night rhythm, and eventually I convinced myself that I was safe, that the worst was over, that whatever had happened in the theater had finally released its grip on me. I started walking again, slower now, my legs aching, my thoughts numb and sluggish, and I didn't stop until I reached my apartment building, its familiar brick facade a sight so comforting it nearly brought me to tears. Inside, the lobby lights hummed softly, the elevator creaked its way up to my floor, and when I finally closed my apartment door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place with a solid, reassuring click, I leaned back against it and laughed shakily, the sound breaking out of me in a rush, half hysteria, half relief. I told myself I would sleep, that everything would look different in the morning, that the human mind had a remarkable capacity for turning terror into something distant and manageable with the passage of time. I washed my hands in the bathroom sink, watching the water bead and run over my skin, grounding myself in the sensation, and when I looked up into the mirror, I flinched, but only because I looked like hell, pale, wide-eyed, hair damp with sweat, nothing more sinister than the aftermath of a bad night. I turned away, finished getting ready for bed, and crawled under the covers, pulling them up to my chin like a child, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around me, pipes knocking softly, someone's television murmuring through a wall, all the ordinary noises that told me I wasn't alone. Sleep came in fits and starts, shallow and restless, filled with half-formed images of dark hair and flickering light, and when I woke in the early hours of the morning, my mouth dry and my heart pounding, it took me a few seconds to remember where I was. The room was dim, the city's glow filtering in through the curtains, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night in fragments, testing each memory, prodding it for weak spots, for signs that it might unravel under scrutiny. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I rolled onto my side, reaching for my phone on the nightstand to check the time, the blue-white light flaring briefly in the darkness. That was when I noticed the reflection in the darkened screen, faint but unmistakable, hovering just behind my own face. Someone was standing there, close enough that I should have felt their presence, their outline distorted by the angle but familiar all the same. Shoulders slightly hunched, head tilted just so, black hair falling straight and still. I didn't turn. I couldn't. My body went rigid, every muscle locked in place as if movement itself had become forbidden, and I stared at that reflection, my breath shallow and silent, waiting for it to resolve, for my eyes to adjust, for my brain to offer up some harmless explanation. The reflection leaned closer, and the face came into focus, or rather, failed to, its features blurred and indistinct, as if they refused to settle into anything recognizable, and a cold, patient understanding washed over me then, heavier than fear, heavier than panic, because I knew exactly what I was seeing. The voice came softly, right behind my ear, so close I felt the faintest brush of breath against my skin, and it spoke with the same calm curiosity I remembered from the theater, the same gentle insistence. "You're still in the way," it said, and I realized, with a sinking certainty that hollowed me out from the inside, that it didn't matter how far I ran or how many doors I locked, because as long as I occupied a space someone else wanted, as long as I existed where I wasn't supposed to, I would always be blocking the view. The 8th step. I have always taken the stairs 2 at a time, not because I'm athletic or impatient, but because I like knowing where my feet will land before they get there, because the rhythm of it, up, pause, up, gives shape to the dark, and on nights when the building feels too quiet, when the walls seem to listen, that rhythm is the only thing that convinces me I'm still moving forward. The night it happened was colder than it should have been, even for late October, the kind of cold that doesn't bite so much as seep, settling into your clothes and bones without asking permission, and by the time I reached my building, my breath had already fogged the air in front of me, hanging there longer than it should have before thinning out and disappearing. The hallway lights flickered as I passed beneath them, fluorescent tubes buzzing faintly overhead, their pale glow flattening everything it touched, turning the peeling paint and stained carpet into a single, exhausted color, and I remember thinking absently, tiredly, that the place smelled different tonight. Not bad exactly, just emptier, like dust that had been disturbed and never quite settled back down. I pushed open the stairwell door instead of waiting for the elevator, partly out of habit and partly because the elevator had a way of stopping between floors when it was cold like this, the lights dimming, the air growing stale, and I didn't have the energy for that kind of uncertainty after a double shift. The stairwell greeted me with its usual silence, thick and padded, swallowing the sound of the door closing behind me so completely that it felt as though I'd stepped out of the building rather than deeper into it, and for a moment I stood there, listening, waiting for the familiar echo of distant footsteps or the murmur of a television through the walls. There was nothing, just the soft hum of the emergency light above the landing and the faint, hollow quality of my own breathing. I started up the stairs without thinking, my shoes hitting the concrete in dull, reliable thuds, 2 steps at a time, my body moving on autopilot while my mind drifted somewhere between exhaustion and habit, counting without really counting, the numbers forming themselves quietly in the back of my head the way they always did. This building had been my home for almost 3 years, long enough that I knew its sounds and quirks better than I knew most people, long enough that I could tell which floor I was on just by the pitch of my footsteps and the way the air changed, and I'd never once questioned the staircase itself, never wondered how many steps it had or why they were there, because it had always been consistent, always dependable in the way only inanimate things can be. Each floor was the same, 9 steps from landing to landing, no more, no less, a fact so deeply ingrained in me that I'd never bothered to articulate it before, never thought of it as knowledge so much as muscle memory. I reached the first landing, turned, and kept going, my mind sliding lazily over the day I'd just finished, the conversations that hadn't mattered, the small irritations that would already be forgotten by morning, and that was when something shifted, not dramatically, not enough to stop me outright, but just enough to register as wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain. My foot came down sooner than I expected, the landing meeting my soul a fraction of a second too early, and I stumbled slightly, catching myself on the railing with a sharp intake of breath, my heart giving a quick, startled kick before settling again. I stood there for a moment, hand gripping cold metal, frowning down at the steps below me, my pulse still elevated, and told myself I'd misjudged it, that I was tired, that my legs had simply moved faster than my brain for once. It happens, I thought. You're overthinking it. I shook it off and started up again, deliberately slower this time, paying closer attention to each step, the scrape of rubber on concrete, the faint echo that followed, and as I climbed, a strange, prickling awareness crept over me, the sense that the space around me had subtly rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. The stairwell felt narrower somehow, the walls closer, the ceiling a little lower, and the emergency light at the next landing flickered, its hum deepening into something almost like a whisper at the edge of my hearing. I reached the landing again, stopped, and looked back down the stairs, half expecting to see something obvious that would explain the unease coiling in my chest, but everything looked exactly as it always had, the same gray steps, the same chipped edges, the same faint stains I'd stepped over 100 times before. I laughed softly to myself, the sound brittle in the quiet, and muttered something about working too much, about needing sleep, about the way the mind plays tricks on you when it's pushed too hard, and then I did the one thing I'd never bothered to do before. I counted. 1, I said under my breath as I placed my foot on the first step, the word grounding, solid. 2, my voice sounded strange in the stairwell, too loud, too clear, and I became acutely aware of how alone I was, how completely the building had gone still around me. 3, 4, I climbed slowly now, 1 step at a time, my earlier rhythm abandoned, my focus narrowing until there was nothing but the number in my mouth and the concrete beneath my feet. 5, 6, a cold unease settled into my stomach, heavy and sinking, because I was already closer to the landing than I should have been, the top looming nearer with each count in a way that made my skin crawl. 7. I paused, my foot hovering above the next step, my breath caught halfway in, and for a moment, the stairwell seemed to hold its breath with me, the hum of the light dropping to a barely perceptible thrum. I lowered my foot. The landing met it immediately. There was no 8th step beneath me. I stood there, frozen, my mind blank and buzzing all at once, staring down at the stairs as if they might rearrange themselves if I looked hard enough, if I waited long enough, and a thought surfaced slowly, unbidden, and terrifying in its simplicity. That's not how many there are. I turned and looked up at the floor above me, then back down again, my chest tightening, my mouth dry, and I told myself firmly, desperately, that I must have miscounted, that the numbers had slipped, that they always do when you're anxious, when you're paying too much attention to something that's meant to stay in the background. I took a step back, down to the lower landing, my movements careful now, precise, and started again from the beginning. My voice barely more than a whisper as I counted, slower than before, as if dragging each number out would force the world to comply. 1, 2, 3. The stairwell listened. The lights flickered once. And somewhere deep in the building, something small and solid shifted, making a faint, deliberate sound click, as if a piece had been moved into place, as if the staircase itself were adjusting, preparing for what came next. I stood there longer than I meant to, one foot on the landing, the other hovering uncertainly above the step below, my body locked in an awkward half position that made my calf begin to ache, because moving felt like a decision with consequences, and not moving felt worse, like agreeing to something I didn't understand yet. The stairwell remained quiet, almost politely so, the emergency light buzzing faintly overhead, the air cold and still, and for a moment I wondered if the sound I'd heard, the small, precise click, had been nothing more than the building settling, the way old structures do when the temperature drops, shifting imperceptibly to accommodate stress and time. I wanted to believe that, wanted to let my weight settle fully onto the landing and continue up without another thought. But the unease clinging to me refused to loosen its grip, coiling tighter with every second I hesitated. I forced myself to move, lowering my raised foot back down, retreating to the safety of the lower landing, and as my shoe met the concrete, the familiar solidity of it sent a brief, irrational wave of relief through me, as though I'd narrowly avoided stepping somewhere I wasn't meant to. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, and looked up the stairs again, tracing the edges of each step with my eyes, counting silently this time, letting the numbers form in my head without giving them voice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The landing loomed at the same place it had before, unchanged, stubbornly present, and no matter how I shifted my perspective, no matter how carefully I measured the distance between each rise, there was no space where an eighth step should have been. The realization settled over me with a quiet finality that made my throat tighten. Not because it was dramatic or explosive, but because it was so very, very wrong, and wrong in a way that didn't allow for easy dismissal. I'd lived here long enough to know this staircase as well as I knew my own apartment, and the certainty of that knowledge pressed against my chest now, heavy and insistent, demanding to be acknowledged. I reached out and ran my hand along the railing, the metal cold and slightly rough beneath my fingers, grounding myself in its texture. I tried to remember the last time I'd climbed these stairs without thinking, the last time I'd taken them two at a time, letting habit carry me upward without conscious effort. The memory slipped away from me, strangely elusive, like a word on the tip of my tongue, and that absence frightened me more than the missing step itself, because it suggested a gap not just in the staircase, but in my recollection of it. I shook my head, annoyed with myself, and told myself that memory was fallible, that routine blurred details, that it was entirely possible I'd been mistaken all along, that there had always been 8 steps and I'd simply assumed otherwise. The thought was uncomfortable, but not impossible, and I clung to it as I began to climb again, one careful step at a time, my movements slow and deliberate, my attention fixed on the physical sensations of ascent, the stretch of muscle, the shift of balance, the dull impact of rubber on concrete. 1, 2, 3. The numbers marched on in my head, steady and reassuring, and for a few seconds, the fear loosened its hold, replaced by a tentative sense of control. 4, 5, 6. The landing drew closer, and my pulse quickened despite my efforts to stay calm, a thin sheen of sweat breaking out along my spine as I became acutely aware of how close I was to repeating the same impossible result. 7. I paused again, my foot hovering, my breath shallow, and in that suspended moment, the stairwell seemed to lean in, the walls pressing closer, the light overhead flickering with a faint, stuttering rhythm that made the shadows jump and shudder. I lowered my foot. The landing met it. Again, 8 was still missing. A cold, hollow sensation opened up in my chest, spreading outward, and I straightened slowly, my hand tightening on the railing until my knuckles ached, my gaze fixed on the empty space where the step should have been. "No," I said aloud, the words sounding strange and thin in the quiet, and I laughed softly, the sound brittle and unconvincing, because saying it out loud felt like a way of pushing back, of asserting my version of reality against whatever quiet rule the staircase was trying to impose. "No," I repeated, firmer this time, and turned away from the stairs, my heart pounding, my thoughts racing, because the idea of continuing upwards suddenly felt reckless, like testing a boundary I didn't understand. I decided, then, to go back down, to retreat to my apartment on the lower floor and figure this out in the morning, when the building would be full of noise and light and people, when the staircase would have no choice but to behave the way it was supposed to. I took one step down and stopped short as my foot met resistance almost immediately. The lower landing, closer than it should have been. The distance compressed in a way that mirrored the ascent, and a chill ran through me as I realized that the steps below me were wrong too, their spacing subtly altered, their number uncertain. I counted again, my lips moving silently, my heart hammering, and found that the descent didn't match the climb, that the numbers slipped and shifted no matter how carefully I tracked them, as if the staircase refused to settle into a single, stable configuration. Panic flared, hot and sudden, and I became acutely aware of the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven, echoing off the concrete walls, and layered beneath it, almost too faint to notice at first, was another sound. A soft, rhythmic noise that didn't match my movements at all. It was the sound of footsteps. Not above me, not below me, but somewhere in between, landing precisely where my feet should have been if there were more steps than I could see, if the staircase extended into a space just out of reach of my perception. I froze, my blood roaring in my ears, and listened as the footsteps continued, measured and unhurried, climbing steadily upward through the invisible gap, each step marked by that same small, deliberate click I'd heard before, as if something unseen were placing its weight carefully, methodically, onto a stair that existed only for it. I pressed my back against the wall, my skin cold against the concrete, and waited, counting my breaths now instead of the steps, because counting had begun to feel dangerous, like an invitation, and with every soft, impossible footfall, a single, terrifying thought repeated itself in my mind. If it can use the missing step, what happens when it reaches the landing? I don't know how long I stayed pressed against that wall, listening to the footsteps that didn't belong to any space I could see, because time in the stairwell stopped behaving the way it should have, stretching and folding in on itself until seconds felt thick and heavy and minutes slipped past without leaving any clear impression behind. The emergency light above the landing flickered again, its hum dropping in pitch until it vibrated faintly in my teeth, and with every pulse of that light, the sense of something approaching grew stronger, more deliberate, as though whatever was climbing those unseen steps had all the patience in the world and no reason to hurry. I kept my eyes fixed on the landing, afraid to look up and afraid to look down, my gaze hovering over the concrete as if staring too directly at the stairs might make them rearrange themselves again, might force me to confront a number I wasn't ready to say out loud. The footsteps continued, steady and measured, each one accompanied by that precise, careful click, and I realized with a sickening clarity that they weren't moving toward me in the way a person would, not traveling a distance so much as completing a sequence, filling in a pattern that had been left unfinished. My breathing slowed despite my panic, my body responding to the rhythm against my will, syncing itself to the count I was trying so desperately to avoid, and I felt an urge rise up inside me, strong, irrational, and terrifying to join in, to complete the count, to acknowledge the step that wasn't there by naming it, because the absence itself had begun to feel unstable, like a gap that demanded closure. "Don't," I whispered to myself, the word barely audible, and pressed my palms flat against the wall, grounding myself in the cold, unyielding reality of it. But the urge didn't fade. It sharpened, taking on a weight and clarity that drowned out my fear, until it felt like the most natural thing in the world to simply open my mouth and speak the next number. I clenched my jaw, my teeth aching from the pressure, and tried to think of anything else. My apartment door, the familiar creak of its hinges, the smell of old coffee grounds in the sink, the way the radiator clicked and hissed when it warmed up, but each mundane image slid away from me, replaced by the stark simplicity of the stairs, the rise and fall of concrete, the certainty of sequence. The footsteps reached a point where they should have become visible, where I should have been able to see the shoes, the legs, the body attached to them, but instead, they stopped just short of the landing, lingering there in a way that made my skin crawl, as if whatever was using that missing step was standing directly beneath me, occupying the space where my next movement would have gone. The light flickered again, and in that brief, stuttering illumination, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A shadow, wrong in shape and depth, pressed against the wall beside me, its outline suggesting a form that didn't quite line up with the architecture, a silhouette that bent at angles the stairwell didn't support. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding, and waited for the sound of breath, of speech, of anything that would confirm what I was afraid of. But all I heard was the low hum of the light and my own pulse, thudding insistently in my ears. Then, very softly, so softly I almost missed it, the footsteps resumed, not climbing now, but shifting, adjusting, as if the thing below me were testing its balance, settling into place, and the click sounded again, closer than before, resonating through the concrete and into my bones. I realized then that it wasn't trying to reach the landing at all, that it had already done what it needed to do by occupying the missing step, by completing the staircase in a way that only it could, and that the next part of the sequence belonged to me. The understanding hit me like a wave of ice water, stealing my breath, because it meant that as long as I stayed where I was, frozen and silent, the count remained unfinished, the pattern unresolved. But the moment I moved up or down, I would be forced to acknowledge the step it had claimed, to step past it, to leave it behind, and I had no idea what that would cost me. My legs trembled with the effort of staying still, my muscles burning, and I became acutely aware of how narrow my options were, how the stairwell had become a kind of closed system, a loop defined not by space but by order, by the unspoken rule that there must always be one more step than there should be. A thought surfaced then, slow and dreadful in its clarity. If I refuse to count it, someone else will. The building was old, full of other tenants who came and went at all hours. People who climbed these stairs without thinking, trusting them the way I had trusted them, and the idea of someone else walking into this place, stepping into the gap I was standing beside, filled me with a sudden, fierce urgency. I couldn't let that happen. I didn't know why I was so certain, only that the conviction burned, hot and absolute, overriding my fear, my exhaustion, my instinct to run. And in that moment, I understood that the staircase didn't just happen to be wrong, it was waiting, balancing itself on the edge of incompletion, and it needed someone to finish what had been started. My mouth opened before I could stop myself, my voice emerging hoarse and unsteady, and as the word formed on my tongue, the light above me flickered once more, the hum deepening, the shadows thickening, as if the stairwell itself were leaning in to listen. 8, I whispered, and the sound of it seemed to drop straight down through the concrete, swallowed instantly by the space below, and for a heartbeat, everything went perfectly, impossibly still, the footsteps gone, the pressure easing, the air clearing as if a storm had just passed. Relief washed over me, sharp and dizzying, and I took a step forward without thinking, my foot lifting, moving through space where there should have been nothing and finding solid ground. The missing step was there now, exactly where it belonged, cold and unremarkable beneath my shoe, and the simplicity of it almost made me laugh, almost convinced me that this was how it was supposed to be, that the fear had been nothing more than a trick of the dark. I shifted my weight fully onto it, my balance settling, my body relaxing for the first time in what felt like hours. And that was when I heard the sound behind me, quiet but unmistakable, carrying up through the stairwell with perfect clarity. Another footstep, another click, and then another. Something else had begun to climb, and this time, it wasn't stopping at 8. The moment I realized the footsteps behind me were continuing, counting past where the staircase should have ended, my sense of relief collapsed into something thin and brittle, like ice cracking under sudden weight, and I froze with my foot still planted on that newly returned step, afraid that lifting it again might erase it, might undo whatever fragile balance I'd just restored. The air in the stairwell felt different now, heavier, as though the building itself had exhaled and never bothered to inhale again, and the hum of the emergency light deepened into a low, throbbing vibration that seemed to pulse in time with the unseen movement below. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The idea of seeing what was climbing, of confirming that there really was something there, something using the staircase in a way I never could, felt worse than any uncertainty, worse than the missing step ever had. Another footstep sounded behind me, then another, each one precise, deliberate, accompanied by that same soft click, and with each sound, the pressure in the stairwell intensified, the walls inching closer, the ceiling lowering until it felt as though the space itself were tightening around me, urging me upward. I took a tentative step onto the landing, half expecting it to vanish beneath me the way the step had before, but it held, solid and cold, and I moved again, faster now, driven by a growing certainty that staying where I was meant becoming part of whatever sequence was unfolding behind me. The stairs above looked normal at first glance, their concrete surfaces worn smooth by years of use, but as I climbed, I noticed subtle differences, edges that didn't quite line up, risers that felt just a fraction too high or too low, and the familiar rhythm of ascent refused to settle into anything predictable, forcing me to watch each step carefully, to place my feet with deliberate attention. I reached the next landing and stopped short, my heart slamming painfully against my ribs, because the corridor that should have opened out in front of me wasn't there. Instead of a hallway lined with apartment doors, there was another flight of stairs, identical to the one I'd just climbed, stretching upward into shadow, the emergency light above it flickering weakly, casting long, warped shadows that made the steps seem to ripple and shift. Confusion and fear tangled together in my chest, tightening until it was hard to breathe, and I stood there staring, my mind scrambling for an explanation that would make this make sense, that would turn this into a simple mistake, a trick of perspective, anything but what it felt like, a continuation where there should have been an end. Behind me, the footsteps drew closer, no longer content to remain just out of sight, and I felt their presence like a cold draft at my back, brushing against my calves, urging me onward. I moved without thinking, climbing again, my legs burning, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and as I did, the numbers began to form in my head despite my efforts to stop them, each step slotting neatly into place in an invisible sequence that extended beyond any count I knew how to finish. I lost track of how many steps I took, how many landings I passed that weren't landings at all, because the stairwell no longer followed the logic of floors and levels. It was something else now, a vertical corridor that existed solely to be climbed, and the deeper I went, the more certain I became that I was moving away from the building I knew and into something that wore its shape like a disguise. The footsteps behind me never slowed, never faltered, always matching my pace, always just close enough to remind me that stopping wasn't an option, and with every click, a new, awful understanding settled over me. The staircase wasn't broken. It was growing, extending itself one step at a time, fed by attention, by acknowledgement, by the simple act of counting. My legs finally gave out near a landing that looked no different from the others, and I collapsed forward, catching myself on the railing, my chest heaving, my vision blurring at the edges, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought this was it, that I would be forced to stay here, suspended between steps, until whatever followed me decided the count was finished. Instead, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been, pressing in on me, filling my ears until they rang, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, for a hand to touch my shoulder, for a voice to speak, for the staircase to shift beneath me again. Nothing did. Slowly, cautiously, I straightened and looked ahead, and saw a door. It stood at the top of the next flight, plain and unmarked, its surface worn and scuffed like every other door in the building, and a surge of desperate hope flared in my chest, because a door meant an exit, a boundary, a place where the stairs might finally end. I forced myself up the remaining steps, my movements stiff and uncoordinated, and reached out with a shaking hand to grasp the knob, the cool metal biting into my palm as I turned it and pushed the door open. Beyond it was not a hallway, not an apartment, not anything I recognized at all, but a small, square landing with a single set of stairs leading down, and as I stood there, staring, the realization hit me with crushing force. I wasn't at the top. I was back at the beginning, facing the same staircase I'd started on, the same emergency light humming overhead, the same concrete steps waiting patiently to be counted again, and behind me, somewhere just out of sight, I heard the soft, familiar sound of a foot settling into place, followed by the quiet, inevitable click of a new step being added, ready for the next number I didn't dare to say. I stood on that landing for a long time, staring at the stairs I knew too well, my legs trembling, my breath shallow and uneven, because understanding had finally settled into me with a cold, irreversible weight. The staircase did not want to trap me forever. It wanted me to stay, to become part of its rhythm, its memory, its quiet accounting of space and absence. The emergency light hummed overhead, steady now, almost content, and the air no longer felt hostile so much as expectant, like a room waiting for someone to speak. I tried to step back through the door I'd just come from, but it was gone, replaced by a bare concrete wall, smooth and unmarked, as if there had never been an opening there at all, and the certainty that I was alone pressed in on me, not with panic, but with a dull, aching inevitability. I looked down at the steps, at their worn edges and familiar stains, and I felt a strange, unwelcome tenderness toward them, because they were the only things that hadn't lied to me, not exactly, only asked for something I'd been giving freely my entire life without thinking. I realized then that I could leave, that there was nothing physically stopping me from walking back down to the ground floor and out into the night, except for the knowledge of what would happen if I did, because I had seen how the staircase corrected itself, how it filled gaps and extended endlessly when its order was disturbed, and I knew, with a certainty that made my hands go numb, that if I left now, it would simply wait for someone else to notice, someone else to count, someone else to finish the sequence I had already begun. The idea of that, of another tired tenant stepping into this place, trusting it the way I once had made my chest tighten painfully, and I understood, without anyone having to tell me, what the building required to remain stable, what it had always required, long before I ever moved in. Someone had to remember the correct number of steps. Someone had to stand here, night after night, ensuring that the count never slipped, never wavered, never invited the staircase to grow again. I sat down on the cold concrete, my back against the wall, my body heavy with exhaustion and resignation, and began to count quietly under my breath, not aloud, not fully, just enough to anchor the structure around me, to keep it from stretching into something worse. 1, 2, 3. The steps held, the air steadied. Somewhere deep in the building, something small and solid settled into place with a satisfied little click. Morning never came the way it should have, but the building did wake, filling slowly with the sounds of ordinary life. Doors opening, voices murmuring, footsteps climbing and descending without pause, and I remained where I was, unseen and unremarkable, another shadow in the stairwell that people avoided without knowing why. Later, when the superintendent filed a report about a tenant who'd stopped answering messages, about an apartment left untouched with the lights still off and the bed still neatly made, no one thought to look in the stairwell, because there was nothing to see there but concrete and light and steps that always added up. And even now, when new tenants move in and complain that the stairs feel wrong, that they lose count no matter how careful they are, the building stays quiet, balanced by a presence they'll never notice, a habit that refuses to break, because I am still here, counting what must be counted, making sure the staircase never needs to grow another step. And if you ever climb those stairs late at night and feel the urge to slow down, to double-check the numbers in your head, do yourself a favor and don't, because the moment you try to be certain, the building will remember that it's allowed to ask for more. The road was empty in the way only rural roads ever are, late on a Saturday night, stretched long and dark beneath a sky with no moon to soften its edges, and Asher loved it for that, loved the sense that the world had finally cleared out enough for him to move through it without interruption. The motorcycle engine growled beneath him, a low, steady vibration that traveled up through the frame and into his chest, syncing itself with his heartbeat until it felt less like a machine and more like an extension of his own body, responding instantly to the smallest shift of weight or pressure. Cold air rushed past, tugging at his jacket, threading itself through the seams of his gloves, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of damp soil and fallen leaves, and he laughed as the sound tore away behind him, swallowed by the wind. Behind him, Mara leaned close, her helmet knocking lightly against his as she shouted something he couldn't quite hear, her voice broken up by speed and laughter and the roar of the engine, and he reached back briefly, squeezing her knee in reassurance, a silent promise that everything was fine, that he knew this road, that nothing unexpected ever happened out here. He had driven it dozens of times before, a long, looping stretch that cut through fields and sparse woodland, punctuated by the occasional weathered farmhouse or leaning fence, and he trusted it in the same thoughtless way he trusted his own reflexes, convinced that familiarity was a kind of protection. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel of light through the darkness, illuminating cracked asphalt and the pale lines painted down its center, and for a while, that was all there was. Motion, sound, the simple pleasure of forward momentum. They slowed near a bend where the road widened slightly, a place locals called the Crossroads even though it barely qualified as one, just an old dirt track branching off toward a cluster of trees, its surface uneven and pale in the headlight glare, and Asher felt a familiar flicker of excitement stir in his chest, the itch to accelerate, to test the limits of traction and control, to prove if only to himself that he could handle whatever the road threw at him. "Not here," Mara shouted this time, louder, and he grinned inside his helmet, easing off the throttle just enough to humor her, the bike's growl dropping to a more restrained purr as they passed the turnoff and continued on, the trees closing in on either side. He didn't tell her about the woman he'd visited earlier that evening, partly because he didn't want to deal with her teasing, and partly because saying it out loud would have made it feel more real than he was comfortable with, would have given weight to something he'd already decided didn't deserve it. The tarot reader's place had been tucked away in a row of aging shops near the edge of town, its windows darkened, a simple sign hanging crookedly above the door, and Asher had gone in on a dare, fueled by boredom and a few drinks, expecting cheap theatrics and vague warnings he could laugh off later. The woman herself had been unremarkable, older than he'd expected, her voice tired rather than mystical, and as she laid out the cards, her expression hadn't changed much at all, not even when she paused, her fingers hovering over the spread as if she'd reached something she didn't like. She hadn't tried to frighten him. That was what unsettled him most about it. She'd simply looked up at him, her eyes steady, and said very plainly that he needed to pay attention to his dreams over the next few nights, that there would be a woman he'd see again and again, and that no matter how curious he felt, no matter how certain he became that he needed to know what she looked like, he was not to turn her over. He'd laughed then, a sharp, dismissive sound, told her he didn't dream and that if he did, he certainly wasn't going to take instructions from a deck of cards, and she'd only shrugged, gathering them up with slow, careful movements, as if the warning had never been meant to persuade him in the first place. "It's not about belief," she'd said quietly. "It's about boundaries." The memory surfaced now as they rode, unbidden and irritating, and Asher shook his head slightly, focusing instead on the road ahead, on the way the asphalt gleamed faintly with moisture, on the rhythmic sway of the bike as it followed the gentle curve of the lane. He told himself that the mind liked patterns, that it reached for meaning when there was none to be found, and that whatever stuck with him from that encounter was just leftover adrenaline, nothing more. They reached the outskirts of the woods, where the trees grew thicker, their branches arching overhead to form a loose canopy that swallowed the starlight, and the temperature dropped noticeably, the air turning sharp and damp against his skin. Mara leaned in closer, her grip tightening, and Asher eased off the throttle again, not out of fear but out of instinct. The sense that this part of the road demanded a different kind of attention. It was quiet here, unnaturally so, the usual chorus of insects absent, the wind itself seeming to hush as they moved deeper into the dark, and for a moment, the only sound was the engine's steady hum and the faint rattle of loose gravel beneath the tires. A flicker of movement at the edge of the headlight beam made him tense, his body reacting before his mind caught up. But when he glanced toward it, there was nothing there, just the uneven line of trees and the suggestion of a clearing beyond them. He told himself it was an animal, or a trick of shadow, then pushed the thought aside, accelerating slightly, eager to put this stretch of road behind them. That night, when Asher finally slept, the dream came easily, slipping into his mind without resistance, and it was always the same, a clearing beneath an ancient oak tree, its trunk split and rotting, its branches bare and twisted against a pale, featureless sky, and beneath it, a woman lay motionless on the ground, her hair spread out around her like a dark halo, her body turned away from him so that he could see only her back, the smooth line of her neck disappearing into shadow. In the dream, he always felt the same pull, the same irresistible urge to step closer, to reach out, to turn her over and see her face, and in the dream, he always remembered the warning just in time, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder as his heart hammered in his chest. He would wake then, breathless and unsettled, the image lingering long after the rest of the dream had faded, and each night it returned, sharper, more vivid, the distance between him and the woman shrinking by an imperceptible degree, as if something were counting down. By the fourth night, curiosity outweighed caution, and when he found himself standing beneath the oak once more, the air heavy and still, the smell of damp earth filling his lungs, he didn't hesitate. His fingers brushed the fabric of her coat, cool and slightly rough beneath his touch, and as he turned her body toward him, the sound of shifting cloth seemed impossibly loud in the silence, followed by his own quickened breathing as the face beneath the shadow was finally revealed. The first thing Asher noticed was the silence, the way it pressed in around him as soon as the woman's body rolled onto its back, swallowing the clearing and the oak and even the sound of his own breathing, leaving behind a hollow, airless stillness that felt less like the absence of noise and more like something actively listening. For a fraction of a second, he thought the warning had been exaggerated after all, that this was just another ordinary dream sharpened by repetition, because the woman's face was calm, almost peaceful, her lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile that didn't belong to fear or pain. And that small normality steadied him just long enough for the rest of the details to sink in. Where her eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin, stretched tight and unbroken, the faint impression of sockets beneath it like hollows, filled in too carefully, and running from temple to temple, stitched with deliberate precision, was a seam of black thread. Each loop pulled snug as if whoever had done the work had taken their time, intent on making it last. Asher's stomach clenched, a wave of delayed revulsion rolling through him, and he tried to step back, to put distance between himself and that impossible face. But his feet wouldn't move, rooted to the damp earth, as though the ground itself had decided to keep him there. The woman's smile widened by the smallest, most unsettling degree, and though her mouth never opened, he heard her voice clearly, close and intimate, as if she were speaking from somewhere just behind his eyes. "You wanted to know," it said, and the words settled into him with a quiet finality that made his chest ache. He woke with a sharp gasp, his body jerking upright in bed. Sheets twisted around his legs, his heart hammering so hard it left him lightheaded, and for several seconds he could still see that stitched smile hovering in the darkness, superimposed over the familiar outline of his bedroom. Mara stirred beside him, mumbling something incoherent, and Asher lay back down slowly, staring at the ceiling, telling himself firmly that it was just a dream, that dreams borrowed images and sensations from waking life and rearranged them into nonsense, that there was no reason to read anything more into it than that. But when sleep finally claimed him again, it didn't bring relief. Instead, the dream returned in fragments throughout the night, the clearing flashing behind his closed eyes whenever he drifted too close to rest, the sound of fabric shifting, echoing in his ears long after he was awake. By morning, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin, and the image of the woman's face followed him through the day, intruding at odd moments the reflection in a darkened window, the smooth curve of a mannequin's features in a shop display, and the neat stitches on a jacket seam, each one tugging at the memory until it felt less like something he'd imagined and more like something he'd been shown. He didn't tell Mara about the dream, not the way it had changed, not the part where he'd crossed the line he'd been warned about, because saying it out loud would have meant acknowledging the unease that had begun to seep into everything, coloring even the familiar routines of his day with a faint, persistent dread. That evening, as dusk settled, and the world outside took on that muted, in-between quality he'd always loved, Asher suggested another ride, eager to shake off the lingering tension, to replace it with the clean, uncomplicated thrill of speed and motion. Mara hesitated, studying his face for a moment as if she were trying to read something there, then shrugged and grabbed her helmet, trusting him the way she always had. The road greeted them with the same empty promise it had before, headlights cutting through the gathering dark, engine vibrations steady and reassuring beneath him, and for a while, Asher let himself believe that this was all he needed, that whatever line he'd crossed in his sleep couldn't follow him out here. They rode past the crossroads again, the dirt track pale and inviting in the beam of the headlights, and this time, Asher felt a strange pull toward it, a subtle pressure behind his eyes that made his hands tighten on the grips without conscious thought. He didn't turn down, it didn't even slow, but as they passed, he glanced toward the trees, and for a heartbeat, he saw something that made his breath catch painfully in his throat, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the road, half hidden by shadow, her upper body suspended unnaturally upright as if the ground beneath her had fallen away, her dark hair lifting slightly in a breeze he couldn't feel. The bike wobbled as his attention faltered, and Mara shouted, clutching him tighter, her voice sharp with alarm, snapping him back into the present just long enough for the figure to vanish, the roadside returning to its empty, ordinary state as if nothing had been there at all. He didn't mention it, didn't trust himself to, and they rode on in silence. The easy laughter from the night before conspicuously absent, replaced by a tension that settled between them like a held breath. As they neared the edge of town, the road straightened and widened, the distant glow of streetlights bleeding into the darkness, and Asher felt a fleeting surge of relief, the sense that they were leaving the uneasy quiet of the countryside behind. It was then that the dream bled into waking completely, the boundary between the two dissolving without warning, because ahead of them, illuminated starkly in the headlights, stood the woman from beneath the oak, her lower body missing as if it had never existed, her upper half hovering just above the asphalt, her stitched smile unmistakable even at a distance. Asher's mind went blank, his body reacting on instinct as he swerved, the bike veering sharply as he tried to avoid her, and in that split second of chaos, the sound of a truck horn exploded into the night, loud and sudden and impossibly close, followed by the shriek of tires and the deafening crash of metal on metal. The world fractured into noise and motion, the bike wrenching violently beneath him, Mara's scream tearing loose from her throat as they were thrown free, and as Asher hit the ground, the impact driving the air from his lungs, the last thing he heard, clear and heavy and final, was the sound of something solid striking the road nearby. A single, unmistakable thump, and then everything went dark. Asher did not lose consciousness all at once. It happened in layers, like the night itself folding inward, sound thinning before sight, sensation slipping away piece by piece until only pain remained, sharp and insistent, anchoring him to a body that no longer felt like it belonged to him. He lay on his back on the cold road, staring up at a sky that seemed too wide, too empty, the stars blurred and smeared by tears he hadn't realized were there, and every breath came with a wet, rattling effort that made his chest burn. Somewhere close by, metal creaked and ticked as it cooled, the motorcycle lying twisted and silent on its side, and beyond that, voices overlapped in fragments shouting, swearing, someone calling for help, but they sounded distant and distorted, as if carried through water. He tried to turn his head, to find Mara, to make sure she was still moving, still breathing, but his neck refused to cooperate, sending a bolt of agony down his spine that stole what little air he had left. The road smelled wrong, a mix of oil and hot rubber and something darker, coppery, and the scent dragged his thoughts back to the dream with cruel clarity, to the damp earth beneath the oak, to the sound of fabric shifting as he turned the woman over. A shadow fell across his vision, blocking out the stars, and for a heartbeat he thought the woman had returned, that her stitched smile was hovering above him, waiting for him to look up again. But when his focus sharpened, it was a stranger's face instead, pale and strained, lips moving too fast for him to follow. "Stay with me," the stranger was saying, hands pressing down on his shoulders, firm and insistent, and Asher wanted to laugh at the irony of it, at the idea that staying was something he still had a choice about. His gaze drifted past the stranger, drawn inexorably toward the edge of the road, where the trees pressed close, their branches tangled and bare, and there, just beyond the reach of the flashing lights, he saw the oak. It shouldn't have been there, he knew that, even through the haze of pain and shock, but recognition cut through his confusion like a blade, because the tree was unmistakable, its trunk split and rotting, its roots clawing up through the soil in the same familiar pattern he'd seen night after night. Beneath it lay a shape, face down and still, dark hair spread across the ground, and a cold, terrible understanding settled over him as he realized he was looking at himself, at his own body arranged with the same quiet inevitability as the woman's had been in his dreams. Panic flared weakly, a last, instinctive resistance, and he tried to scream, to warn someone, to do anything that might disrupt the pattern, but no sound came out, his voice lost somewhere between intention and breath. The shadow beside the oak shifted, and the woman stepped forward, whole now, complete in a way she never had been before, her feet touching the ground lightly as if she weighed nothing at all, her face still turned away from him. She knelt beside his prone body and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle, almost reverent, and Asher felt it echo through him, a phantom sensation that made his chest ache. Slowly, deliberately, she turned him over, the sound of fabric against earth loud in the sudden hush that fell over the scene, and when she leaned close, her stitched smile inches from his face, he understood at last what the warning had meant. It wasn't about curiosity, or fear, or even fate in the abstract. It was about respect for the boundary between what was meant to be seen and what was meant to remain hidden, about the cost of insisting on answers when silence would have been enough. "You see now," her voice murmured, not unkindly, and the words wrapped around him like a closing door. The world snapped back into painful clarity. Then the flashing lights, the voices, the cold road beneath him, and Asher's awareness shattered completely, leaving nothing behind but the echo of that final understanding and the certainty that the road had never been leading forward at all, only back to this place, this moment, this ending that had been waiting patiently for him to arrive. The story, when it was told later, never sounded the way it had felt, and that was the first thing Mara noticed when she woke up in the hospital with a raw throat and a pounding headache, listening to a police officer recite the events of the crash in a calm, procedural voice that smoothed away all the jagged edges. According to him, the truck driver had been sober and alert, the road conditions merely damp, not dangerous, and Asher had lost control while taking the bend too fast. Nothing more mysterious than that, nothing that required explanation beyond speed and bad timing. Mara nodded when she was supposed to, answered questions as best she could, and stared at the pale green wall behind the officer's head, trying to reconcile his words with the fragments still echoing in her mind. The sudden swerve, the impossible certainty in Asher's body as he reacted to something she hadn't seen, the way his grip had tightened just before everything went wrong. She didn't mention the figure by the roadside, the half-glimpsed shape that had made her heart lurch even as she screamed his name, because it felt too insubstantial, too easily dismissed as shock or imagination, and because the look on the officer's face suggested he was already done with the supernatural for the night. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee, the steady beep of a monitor marking time in a way that felt both reassuring and oppressive, and as the officer left, Mara turned her head toward the empty bed beside hers, the one that had been prepared and then stripped again, its sheets folded away as if it had never been needed. Asher had died at the scene. They told her gently, his injuries too severe, and the words slid over her without fully landing, leaving behind a numb, hollow space where grief would eventually take root. In the days that followed, she moved through the world in a fog, not unlike the one that had clung to the road that night, attending meetings and making phone calls and signing forms she barely remembered afterward, all of it accompanied by the persistent sense that something essential was missing from the official narrative, that there was a gap no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. The accident site became a point of quiet fixation for her, a place she felt drawn back to despite herself, and when she finally returned there with a friend a week later, the road looked painfully ordinary, the asphalt patched and dry, the trees lining it unremarkable in the flat light of day. The oak was there, though, set a short distance back from the shoulder, its trunk split and decayed exactly as Asher had described in passing once, months before any of this had happened, when he'd mentioned a strange dream and laughed it off as nothing. Mara stood at its base, her hand resting against the rough bark, and tried to imagine the crash unfolding there. The chaos and noise and sudden violence, but the place resisted her efforts, holding onto its silence with stubborn insistence. She noticed then that the ground beneath the tree was scuffed and uneven, as though something heavy had been dragged across it, and a chill crept up her spine as she realized that the marks didn't align with the road, didn't match the angle of the impact described in the report. That night, sleep brought no rest. Instead, Mara found herself standing in the clearing beneath the oak, the air heavy and still, the sky a pale, featureless gray, and though she knew she was dreaming, the knowledge offered no comfort, only the uneasy sense that she had stepped into a place that existed whether she was awake or not. She saw Asher there, lying face down on the ground, his body strangely intact, his jacket unmarked, and she felt an overwhelming urge to run to him, to turn him over, to confirm with her own eyes that he was all right, that this was just another cruel trick of the mind. The warning came to her then, not in words but as a pressure behind her eyes, a visceral understanding that made her hesitate, her hands clenching at her sides as she fought the impulse to cross that final distance. The woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her back to Mara, her dark hair lifting slightly in a breeze that stirred nothing else. And though she didn't turn, Mara knew with bone-deep certainty that she was being watched, measured, weighed. She woke with a start, her heart racing. The image of Asher's still form burned into her thoughts, and for the first time since the crash, she cried openly, the grief breaking through her numbness in great, shuddering waves. In the weeks that followed, she avoided that stretch of road, choosing longer routes and daylight hours. But the dreams didn't stop, repeating with subtle variations that always ended the same way. Asher lying beneath the oak, the woman standing nearby, and the unbearable tension of not knowing what would happen if she crossed the boundary she now understood too well. Friends told her this was part of mourning, that the mind clung to familiar images as a way of processing loss, and she nodded and pretended to believe them, even as a different understanding took shape inside her, quieter but more insistent. Some places, she realized, were not meant to be interfered with, some stories not meant to be completed, and Asher's mistake hadn't been curiosity alone, but the refusal to accept that certain faces were meant to remain unseen. By the time the dreams began to fade, replaced by a dull, persistent ache, Mara had learned to wake herself just before the critical moment, just before her feet would carry her across the clearing, and she held on to that restraint like a lifeline, because on the rare mornings when she failed, when sleep pulled her too deep, she would wake with the unsettling sense that someone else had finished the dream for her, that somewhere beneath the oak, the ground had shifted slightly, as if accommodating a body newly turned. They buried Asher on a clear morning. The sky, a flat, indifferent blue that made the black coats and bowed heads look strangely theatrical, and the priest's words drifted over the small crowd without ever quite landing, familiar phrases about rest and peace spoken into a silence that refused to absorb them. Mara stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her fingers ached, listening without hearing, her attention fixed instead on the memory of another place entirely, the clearing beneath the oak, the way the air had pressed close around her in the dream, the certainty that had stopped her feet just short of the line she hadn't dared to cross. The official report was finalized a week later, neat and conclusive, and it stated plainly that Asher had been thrown from the motorcycle on impact, that his body had come to rest several yards from the road, and that death had been instantaneous, sparing him prolonged suffering. It did not mention the oak tree. It did not mention the way the responders had found him lying face down at its base, his position oddly deliberate, his features untouched by the worst of the wreckage, as if he had been placed there rather than flung. When Mara asked, quietly, why that detail hadn't been included, the officer she spoke to hesitated for a fraction of a second before offering a vague explanation about irrelevant variables and simplifying narratives, his gaze sliding away from hers as if there were something about the truth that resisted being written down. In the months that followed, the stretch of road near the crossroads acquired a reputation, the kind that spreads without anyone quite taking responsibility for it, whispered between locals and passed along with a shake of the head, and people began to avoid it after dark, citing a feeling rather than a reason, a sense that the place demanded something from those who lingered too long. A memorial appeared briefly at the edge of the asphalt flowers, a photograph. A helmet hung carefully from a low branch, but it never stayed intact for more than a night or two, disturbed not by vandals but by the subtle, persistent rearrangement of things, as if the ground itself rejected additions, insisting on its own stark simplicity. Mara returned to the oak only once more, late one afternoon when the light was already beginning to thin, and she stood there listening to the wind move through the bare branches, fighting the familiar urge to imagine Asher where she'd last seen him in her dreams. She didn't step closer. She didn't touch the bark. She had learned, painfully and thoroughly, the cost of crossing that final boundary, and she left without looking back, carrying with her the quiet, heavy knowledge that restraint could be a form of survival. Years later, long after the dreams had finally loosened their grip, long after the road had been resurfaced and the rumors softened into something almost quaint, a driver traveling alone late at night would swear they saw a woman standing at the crossroads, her back turned, her dark hair lifting gently in a breeze that didn't reach the road. They would slow, heart-pounding, unsure of what they were seeing, and if they were wise, they would keep their eyes forward and their hands steady, passing by without stopping, without turning, without trying to complete a story that had already taken its due. Because those who insist on seeing what lies on the other side of the warning, those who refuse to let a face remain unturned, tend to be found the same way Asher was silent, still, and face down beneath the oak, leaving behind only the echo of a lesson learned too late. Some paths end not because the road runs out, but because you were never meant to see where they lead. The widow's bargain. Death did not come to Elias like a revelation or a reckoning. It came quietly, in the middle of what should have been the safest week of his life, slipping into him between heartbeats and leaving him on a hotel bed that still smelled faintly of salt air and fresh sheets. He learned he was dead not all at once, but gradually, through absence, the absence of pain, of weight, of breath, and then through repetition, through the way the same morning light kept spilling across the same window without ever warming his skin, through the way the room refused to change no matter how long he stood there watching it. By the time he understood that the world had moved on without him, he had already been moved as well, drawn inexorably back to the place where his name had been carved into stone before his body had even cooled. The cemetery greeted him with a familiar cold, sharper than the air he remembered from life, the wind threading its way through bare branches and sending dry leaves skittering across the gravel paths in small, nervous bursts. Cars passed somewhere beyond the low iron fence, their engines a distant, indifferent hum, and Elias stood beside his own headstone, reading the dates again even though he knew them by heart, tracing the shallow grooves of his name with eyes that no longer blinked. He was not alone there, though loneliness still found him easily. Ivy lingered a few rows away, perched on the edge of a neighboring grave with her knees drawn up, her form pale and insubstantial against the dark stone, her expression caught somewhere between boredom and quiet resignation. She had died years before him. She'd told him once, crushed beneath expectations that no one else had seemed to notice, and now she drifted through the cemetery as if it were a waiting room she'd never been called out of. They talk sometimes, the dead do, not because conversation changes anything, but because memory needs somewhere to settle. And Elias had found himself telling her about Marin, about the way she laughed too quickly when she was nervous, about the ring he'd barely had time to get used to wearing. Ivy listened with the patient detachment of someone who had already learned how little the living could be trusted to stay the way you remembered them, occasionally commenting on the weather or the visitors who passed through, her voice carrying easily through the cold air. That afternoon had been quiet, the kind of late autumn quiet that pressed down gently rather than threatening, and Elias was just beginning to think that Marin wouldn't come that day, that she had moved on to newer traditions, newer obligations when he felt it, a subtle shift in the air that had nothing to do with temperature. Footsteps approached along the gravel path, measured and careful, and Elias turned toward the sound out of habit more than hope, his chest tightening as two figures came into view between the rows of stones. Marin walked slightly ahead, her coat pulled tight around her, her hair shorter than he remembered, and beside her was a man Elias had never seen before, his hand resting at her back with an easy familiarity that made something twist sharply inside what remained of Elias's heart. They stopped in front of the headstone, and for a moment, no one spoke, the wind filling the silence with the soft, restless whisper of leaves. Elias watched Marin closely, cataloging the small changes, the tired set of her shoulders, the way her gaze lingered on his name before dropping away, and a bitter thought surfaced unbidden, one he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd realized death did not erase attachment. She didn't wait. Ivy glanced at him from her perch, her expression unreadable, and said nothing, as if she already knew where his thoughts were headed. The man shifted his weight, checking his phone, the glow of the screen briefly illuminating his face, and Elias felt an irrational surge of resentment at the mundane intimacy of it, at the way life continued to assert itself in small, careless gestures. Marin knelt then, placing a bouquet of late chrysanthemums at the base of the stone, her fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary, and as she did, her thoughts brushed against Elias with a startling clarity, not as words spoken aloud, but as a low, intimate murmur that settled directly into him, bypassing ears entirely. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," her voice seemed to say, threaded with exhaustion rather than guilt, "but I couldn't stay alone." Elias recoiled instinctively, the shock of it sending a ripple through his form, because this was new, this closeness, this unwanted access to the living, and he realized with a sudden, hollow ache that grief had thinned the boundary between them, that Marin's visit had brought her thoughts dangerously close to where he lingered. She stood and brushed dirt from her knees, her breath fogging the air, and continued silently, her inner voice pressing on despite his resistance. "I needed someone who could stand beside me, someone who could be there." Elias wanted to turn away, to retreat into the familiar numbness of the cemetery, but something held him there, forced him to listen as the truth unfolded, not as an accusation, but as an explanation that refused to soften itself for his comfort. The man beside her cleared his throat, murmured that they should go, that it was getting cold, and Marin nodded distractedly, reaching into her pocket before hesitating, her hand closing briefly around something Elias couldn't see. Ivy slid down from her grave then, drifting closer, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the tension thickening the air, and she looked at Elias with something like sympathy in her eyes, as if she understood that this was the moment where the dead learned what the living were willing to trade in order to keep going. Marin stood there longer than she needed to, her gloved hands folded loosely in front of her, her gaze fixed on the stone as if she were waiting for it to respond, and Elias felt the pull again, that uncomfortable closeness that came not from touch but from proximity of thought, from the way grief had thinned her defenses until her inner voice slipped free and drifted toward him whether she intended it to or not. "You think I left you?" Her thoughts murmured, weary and raw. "But I never did. Not really." And the admission landed heavily, settling into him with a weight that surprised him with its persistence. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself, and the air around them seemed to hold still, Ivy watching quietly from a few steps away, her presence a pale anchor in the shifting moment. The man beside Marin shifted again, glancing down the path, his impatience a small, living reminder of time's relentless forward push, and Marin winced slightly, as if she felt it too, as if she were being tugged in opposite directions by obligations that refused to reconcile themselves. I tried. Her thoughts continued, threading their way through Elias with an intimacy that felt almost cruel. I tried to be alone the way people expect widows to be, quiet and devoted to memory, but the days kept coming, and the nights were worse, and there was no one there to hear me breathe. Elias flinched, the truth of it striking deeper than any accusation could have, because death had stripped him of the illusion that love alone could sustain someone left behind, had shown him instead the brutal practicality of survival. He watched as Marin reached into her coat pocket at last, drawing out a small envelope creased from handling. Its edges softened, and for a moment she hesitated again, her fingers tightening around it as if weighing a decision she'd already made but still needed to justify. There are things you don't get to plan for, her thoughts whispered, quieter now, edged with something like fear, things that happen whether you're ready or not, and Elias felt a cold clarity settle over him as he understood, before she ever revealed it, what she was about to say. She crouched once more, placing the envelope at the base of the stone, alongside the flowers, her movements careful, deliberate, and as she did, the truth slipped free at last, unguarded and undeniable. I was pregnant, her inner voice said simply, and the words reverberated through Elias with a force that left him reeling. Fragments of a future he'd never imagined splintering outward in every direction. The wind stirred, sending leaves skittering across the gravel in a sudden rush, and Ivy looked away, giving him the courtesy of privacy even in death. Marin's hand lingered over the envelope, her breath trembling slightly, and she went on, the admission unfolding with painful honesty. Your child. I didn't know how to tell anyone. I didn't know how to do it alone. Elias felt something inside him give way then, a sharp, tearing release that was not quite grief and not quite relief, because the knowledge carried both at once, the promise of continuity tangled inseparably with the ache of absence. He watched Marin rise, watched the man beside her step closer without touching her, his concern evident but restrained, and Elias understood, in that moment, the shape of the bargain she had made, not a betrayal born of convenience, but a deliberate choice forged under pressure, a decision to anchor herself to the living world in whatever way she could. I needed someone who could stand in the light, her thoughts concluded softly, someone who could be there for the child you'll never get to hold, and the sentence settled into a quiet finality that left no room for argument. The man's phone chimed then, a bright, intrusive sound that shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment, and he murmured an apology, glancing toward the parking lot where their car waited, engine already cooling. Marin nodded, wiping her eyes quickly, the practiced motion of someone accustomed to containing herself in public, and reached into her bag once more, drawing out a few thin sheets of ceremonial paper, folded carefully despite their out-of-place presence. She lit them with a match cupped against the wind, the flame flaring briefly before settling, and as the paper curled and darkened, Elias felt a strange warmth ripple through him, not physical, but emotional, a recognition that some gestures carried meaning beyond their cultural context. Marin bowed her head, just slightly, her lips moving in a silent apology or prayer that Elias felt rather than heard, and then she straightened, placing the match carefully aside before turning away from the grave. As she walked back down the path, her arm slipping through the man's with tentative familiarity, Elias remained where he was, watching until the two figures disappeared from view, the cemetery returning slowly to its earlier stillness. Ivy drifted back to his side then, her expression gentler than before, and said nothing, because there were moments when even the dead recognized the limits of consolation. Elias looked down at the envelope, at the place where Marin had knelt, and felt the sharp edge of his resentment dull into something quieter, something more complex, because beneath it all, beneath the ache and the loss, there was a fragile, unexpected thread of hope winding its way through him, the knowledge that a part of him still moved forward in the world of the living, carried by hands that could protect it, nurtured by choices he had not been there to make, but could finally, reluctantly, understand. The cemetery felt emptier after Marin left. Not in the literal sense, cars still passed beyond the fence, leaves still scraped softly across stone, but in a way Elias had no language for, as if something essential had been taken with her, leaving behind a hollow that even the dead could feel. He remained by the headstone, staring at the envelope she had placed there, resisting the urge to reach for it despite knowing that touch, for him, was now more memory than action, more intention than movement. The knowledge she had left behind pressed against him from all sides, reshaping his understanding of what his death had interrupted, and for the first time since he had become aware of himself as something other than living, Elias felt the passage of time not as a blur but as a weight, each unexperienced moment stacking quietly atop the last. Ivy broke the silence eventually, her voice soft and observational, as if she were commenting on the weather rather than the fracture of a life. "You know," she said, tracing the edge of a nearby stone with one translucent finger, "most of us don't leave anything behind that lasts. Just habits, maybe regrets." Elias didn't answer right away. He was thinking of the word inheritance, of how it had once meant furniture and money and names passed down through paperwork and ceremony. Never this. Never. The idea of being carried forward through blood he would never see, through a future he would never step into. He wondered what kind of father he would have been, whether he would have been patient or anxious, whether he would have known how to hold something so fragile without breaking it, and the speculation hurt more than certainty ever could have, because it was endless, unresolvable. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," he said finally, the admission quiet and unguarded, and Ivy nodded, as if that were the most reasonable response imaginable. "You're not supposed to feel one thing," she replied. "That's the trick." The wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant scent of exhaust and damp earth, and Elias felt himself drawn, inexplicably, to the envelope at his feet, to the thin promise it represented, and when he focused on it, really focused, he became aware of something else layered beneath it, something older than paper and flowers, something like a tether stretching outward from the grave and into the world beyond. It wasn't a pull, not exactly, but a connection, faint and humming, and he realized with a start that Marin's child, his child, had anchored him in a way he hadn't known was possible, binding him, not just to memory but to continuation. The revelation unsettled him, not because it felt wrong, but because it suggested a responsibility he hadn't anticipated, a role that extended beyond mourning and observation. He drifted back from the stone, testing the boundaries of this new awareness, and felt the tether stretch with him, resilient but not infinite, urging him gently back toward the place where his name was carved. "Careful," Ivy said, watching him with narrowed eyes. "Some connections don't like to be tested." Elias returned to the headstone, the pressure easing as he did, and let the realization settle. He could not follow Marin into her new life, could not watch over the child in any way that resembled protection, but he could remain here, holding the place where he had ended steady, ensuring that the dead did not intrude further than they already had. The cemetery, he understood now, was not merely a resting place. It was a boundary, one that required tending just as surely as the living required shelter. As dusk deepened into evening, Elias found a strange calm taking root within him, born not of resignation, but of purpose, and when Ivy eventually drifted away to her own corner of the grounds, he stayed, standing watch beside the stone, listening to the world continue at a distance. Somewhere far from the cemetery, a child was growing, heartbeat strong and insistent, and the knowledge of it softened the sharpest edges of his loss, transforming them into something bearable, something almost like resolve. He could not be present in the ways that mattered most, but he could endure, could hold his place without bitterness, and in doing so, honor the choice Marin had made not as a betrayal, but as an offering to life itself. Winter settled in quietly, the way it always did, without ceremony or warning, frosting the cemetery stones in the early mornings and muting the colors of the world until everything seemed carved from the same cold palette. Elias learned the rhythms of this season quickly, learned how the dead adjusted when the living retreated indoors, how the hours stretched longer in the absence of visitors, how the silence took on a different texture beneath a sky heavy with snow. He remained by his grave, not out of obligation alone, but because the tether he had felt that afternoon persisted, a faint, steady pull that reminded him of what was still at stake, of the fragile continuity that depended, in some unspoken way, on his restraint. Ivy returned often, drawn by the change in him as much as by the monotony of her own wandering, and they spoke more now, not just of the past, but of the quiet rules that governed their existence, rules no one had ever explained, but everyone eventually learned. The dead, Ivy told him, were allowed memory and longing, but not interference, allowed to observe, but not to guide, allowed to forgive, but never to bargain for what had been lost. Elias listened, absorbing each unadorned truth, and recognized in them the shape of the choice he had already begun to make, the acceptance that came not from understanding but from necessity. On certain nights, when the wind carried sounds from the nearby road, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, the distant echo of laughter drifting from a passing car, Elias felt the pull of curiosity rise again, the urge to know how Maren fared, how the child grew, whether the man at her side proved worthy of the role he had taken on. Each time, he resisted, anchoring himself instead to the cold stone beneath his name, because he had learned that knowledge, once sought, could not always be set aside, and that even love could become a trespass if it crossed the wrong boundary. There were moments, rare but sharp, when grief surged anew, catching him unprepared, and in those moments, the cemetery seemed to respond, shadows deepening, the air thickening as if the dead themselves leaned closer, listening for permission. Elias understood then what Ivy had meant about tending the boundary. Emotions left unchecked could ripple outward, inviting attention from things less patient, less forgiving, and so he learned to let the feelings pass through him without anchoring them, to acknowledge loss without feeding it. The envelope Maren had left eventually dissolved beneath the elements, its contents unreadable, its purpose fulfilled, and Elias felt a quiet rightness in that, a sense that some messages were meant to exist only briefly, long enough to be received and released. As the year turned and visitors returned in fits and starts, Elias noticed something else as well, the way people lingered less near his grave, how their conversations fell to murmurs before resuming at a distance, as if the space itself had grown heavier, less accommodating to careless presence. It was not power he felt there, but stewardship, the subtle effect of a will set firmly in place, holding rather than reaching. Ivy watched this change with interest, occasionally offering dry commentary, but there was respect in her gaze now too, an acknowledgement that Elias had found his role, limited though it was. "Most don't," she said once, kicking absently at a drift of leaves that refused to move. "They either cling too hard or disappear entirely." Elias considered that, looking out over the rows of stones and markers, and felt a quiet certainty settle in him because he knew which fate he was choosing. He would remain, not as a watcher of the living, but as a keeper of the line he himself had nearly crossed, ensuring that love did not become a reason for the dead to reach back and pull. And somewhere beyond the reach of his awareness, beyond the pull of the tether, life continued, unfolding without his guidance but not without his influence. And that, he realized, was the only bargain worth honoring. By the time the second winter passed, Elias no longer measured time by seasons or visitors, but by absence, the absence of strain in the air, the absence of that restless pull that once urged him to look beyond the iron fence and into the lives he no longer belonged to. The cemetery had settled into him the way a shoreline settles into the sea, not as a prison, but as a shape he finally understood, and standing there beside his name, he felt something close to peace for the first time since his death. It was not happiness, not relief, but a quiet equilibrium born of restraint, of knowing where he ended and where the living began. On a late afternoon when the light slanted low and pale across the stones, Ivy appeared once more, her form thinner now, more diffuse, as if she were already beginning to fade into whatever came next for those who learned to let go. She didn't speak at first, only looked at him with a small, knowing smile, and Elias sensed that this, too, was a kind of ending. "You did well," she said eventually, her voice barely more than a suggestion in the cold air. Elias inclined his head, accepting the sentiment without pride, because he knew that what she meant was simple. He had not reached back, had not demanded more than what had been given. As dusk deepened, a car passed on the road beyond the fence, its headlights sweeping briefly across the cemetery before disappearing into the distance, and for a fleeting moment, Elias felt the echo of that old curiosity stir, the desire to know who rode inside, where they were going, whether the child he would never meet was warm and safe and loved. The feeling rose and then passed, unanchored, leaving behind only a gentle ache that no longer demanded resolution. He had learned, at last, that love did not require proximity to endure, that it could exist as intention rather than action, as hope rather than possession, somewhere, beyond his reach and beyond his sight. Marin's child would grow up hearing a story softened by time, a story about a man who had died young and left behind a name, and that would be enough. The dead, Elias understood now, did not need to be remembered in full to matter. They needed only to release the living from obligation, from guilt, from the weight of unfinished bargains. As the night closed in, the cemetery grew still, the boundary he guarded holding firm without effort, and Elias felt himself settle fully into his place, no longer watching for what might be taken, but ensuring that nothing more would be asked. In the end, the comfort he found was not in forgiveness alone, but in succession, in the knowledge that life had continued without him and because of him, and that by stepping aside, by choosing not to interfere, he had finally honored the love he had lost. And so, when visitors passed his stone in the years that followed, and felt an inexplicable calm there, a sense that grief did not linger as heavily as it should have, it was because a promise had been kept quietly and completely. The dead had learned to let the living live, and in doing so, had found the only peace that lasts beyond the grave. The 100-year question. Thatcher had stayed in the field longer than he should have, not because he needed to, but because he hated the idea of stopping just because the light told him to. The sun had already dipped behind the tree line, leaving the land in that dull, blue-gray hush that settled over the hills when the day gave up without ceremony, and the air had taken on a sharpness that crept through wool and denim alike. But Thatcher kept working, his hands moving out of habit rather than urgency, snapping dry stalks free and stacking them with the steady, practiced rhythm of a man who trusted his body more than his judgment. The cornfield stretched out behind him in uneven rows, the broken stems whispering softly as the wind threaded its way through them, and beyond that, the forest rose dark and dense, its edge irregular, its interior swallowing what little light remained. An owl called out somewhere deep among the trees, the sound low and hollow, and Thatcher snorted quietly to himself, adjusting his grip on the bundle he carried, because noises had never bothered him, not since he was a boy running these same fields barefoot, learning early that fear was a luxury reserved for people who didn't have work waiting on them in the morning. The farm had belonged to his family for generations, or so the stories went, and with it came a catalog of warnings he'd learned to ignore. Don't stay out past dusk. Don't answer voices from the tree line. Don't speak back when the forest speaks first. All of it lumped together in his mind with weather, superstitions, and half-remembered sermons, things people said when they didn't have better explanations. He wiped his hands on his trousers and turned toward the barn, already thinking about supper, about the warmth waiting inside, when he noticed how quiet it had become, not the gentle quiet of evening, but something heavier, more deliberate, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The owl had gone silent, the wind had dropped. Even the corn seemed as still, the dry leaves frozen mid-rustle, and Thatcher slowed despite himself, a faint prickle crawling up the back of his neck that he dismissed as cold. He told himself he was tired, that his senses were playing tricks on him after a long day, and started walking again, boots crunching softly on the packed earth, each step sounding louder than the last in the thickened air. He was halfway to the barn when he saw the figure standing at the edge of the field, just where the last of the corn gave way to shadow, tall and motionless, its outline blurred by the fading light. At first, Thatcher assumed it was someone from the neighboring property, maybe a traveler who'd taken a wrong turn, and irritation flared hotter than caution, because the last thing he wanted was company this late, especially the kind that came with questions. "You're on private land," he called out, his voice rough and unwelcoming, carrying farther than he'd expected in the stillness. The figure didn't move. It stood there with its back slightly hunched, shoulders wrapped in a long, loose coat that hung oddly from its frame, too heavy for the season, the brim of a wide hat casting its face into complete shadow. Thatcher felt a flicker of unease then. Not fear exactly, but the irritation sharpened by uncertainty, and he took a few more steps forward, angling himself so the barn remained close, a solid presence at his side. "I said this is private," he repeated, louder now, and the figure shifted at last, its head tilting just enough to suggest it had heard him, that it had been listening all along. When it spoke, the voice was wrong, not loud, not threatening, but carefully placed, each word shaped as if it had been practiced many times before and never quite improved. "Do I look human to you?" it asked, and the question landed with an uncomfortable weight, hanging between them longer than any ordinary sentence should have. Thatcher laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive, because laughter was his default response to discomfort, and he didn't like the way the question tried to pull something out of him, something thoughtful. "Absolutely not," he said without hesitation, the words spilling out with the same blunt certainty he used for broken fences and bad weather, and for a heartbeat. Nothing happened at all. Then the figure's shoulders began to move, the coat shifting in slow, deliberate ripples, and Thatcher realized, too late, that this had never been a question meant to be answered lightly, that whatever stood before him had been waiting not for reassurance, but for permission. The laughter had barely left Thatcher's throat when the air changed, thickening in a way that made each breath feel slightly delayed, as if it had to travel farther than it should have before reaching his lungs, and the figure at the edge of the field began to move, not stepping forward, so much as unfolding, the long coat loosening its shape in slow, unsettling increments. The fabric sagged and shifted as though it were heavy with moisture, clinging where it should have hung free, and as the figure raised one arm, Thatcher noticed how the sleeve slid down too easily, revealing a glimpse of something pale beneath that did not look like skin so much as the inside of skin, smooth and faintly reflective, catching what little light remained with a dull, unhealthy sheen. A smell reached him then, subtle at first and easy to mistake for the ordinary rot of fallen leaves and damp soil, but it sharpened quickly into something more specific, more intimate, a sour, animal tang layered with the unmistakable sweetness of decay, and Thatcher's stomach tightened as his instincts finally, belatedly, began to scream. He took a step back, boots scuffing against the dirt, and the figure responded in kind, closing the distance without haste, its movements careful and economical, as if it had learned long ago the value of conserving energy. The brim of the hat lifted just enough for Thatcher to see beneath it, and what he saw there made his breath hitch painfully in his chest, because the face was wrong in a way that defied easy description, its features arranged with approximate care but lacking cohesion, eyes set a fraction too far apart, mouth stretched too wide, the whole thing held together by seams and patches that glistened faintly, as if they were still damp. The coat fell open then, sliding from its shoulders with a wet sound that made Thatcher gag, and beneath it was not a body in any familiar sense, but a layered assemblage of hides and pelts, stitched and fused together into a crude approximation of a torso, each piece bearing the faint, ghostly impression of whatever it had once belonged to. The creature tilted its head again, studying Thatcher with an intensity that made his skin crawl, and repeated the question, softer this time, almost curious. "Do I look human to you now?" Thatcher didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth had gone dry, his tongue thick and useless, and the only thought that cut through the rising panic was the sudden, visceral certainty that whatever stood before him had not come to hunt or to kill in the way predators did, but to test, to see how closely it could pass for something it was not. The forest behind the creature stirred then, branches creaking softly as if leaning in, and Thatcher turned and ran, the decision snapping into place without conscious thought, his body finally overriding his stubborn pride. He tore across the field toward the barn, lungs burning, heart hammering, the night closing in around him with frightening speed, and behind him he heard the sound of pursuit begin, not a roar or a snarl, but the wet, irregular slap of something heavy, moving too fast, the coat dragging uselessly along the ground as it was shed completely. Thatcher risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't, because the creature was no longer bothering with pretense, its form low and elongated, its movements fluid and wrong, its skin catching on corn stalks and tearing free in strips that hung from it like discarded rags. He veered sharply, aiming for the fence line, his boots slipping on damp earth, and misjudged his footing just enough to send him sprawling forward, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs in a sharp, painful burst. He scrambled to his feet again, panic rising hot and choking, and felt the ground give way beneath him with no warning at all, the solid earth collapsing into emptiness as he plunged downward, flailing helplessly before landing hard in something thick and yielding that swallowed his legs up to the knee. The stench hit him immediately, overwhelming and vile, a concentrated blast of rot and waste that made his eyes water and his throat convulse, and he realized with a surge of horror that he had fallen into the old cesspit behind the barn, long abandoned but never properly filled, its contents churned and awakened by his sudden intrusion. He retched violently, bile burning his throat as he struggled to pull himself free, his hands slick and useless, and above him, silhouetted against the faint light of the barn, the creature skidded to a halt, its movements faltering for the first time. It leaned forward, peering down at him, and as its gaze fell on the mess coating Thatcher's clothes and skin, it recoiled sharply, a sound tearing loose from it that was half snarl, half retch, its face contorting with unmistakable disgust. Thatcher seized the moment, dragging himself out of the pit with a strength born of desperation, tearing free from the sucking grip of the muck and bolting for the nearest tree, the foul smell clinging to him like a second skin. Behind him, the creature hesitated, pacing at the edge of the pit, its earlier confidence replaced by a twitchy agitation, as if the sight and smell of human filth offended it on some fundamental level, and Thatcher ran, branches whipping at his face, the ground rising and falling unpredictably beneath his feet, driven now by a grim, dawning understanding. Whatever this thing was, whatever centuries it had spent perfecting its disguise, there were still parts of humanity it could not bear to touch, and in that revulsion lay his only chance of surviving the test he had failed so badly. Thatcher ran until the forest swallowed him whole, the barn and field falling away behind him as the trees closed in tight and unforgiving, their bare branches clawing at his jacket and face, their roots jutting from the ground like traps set deliberately in his path. His lungs burned with each ragged breath, the stench of the cesspit clinging to him so thickly it felt like a weight dragging at his limbs, and yet he didn't slow, because every instinct he had was screaming the same truth over and over again. Don't let it touch you. The creature followed, though not with the relentless certainty he'd expected. Instead, it circled and surged, darting forward and recoiling in uneven bursts, as if torn between hunger and revulsion, its movements punctuated by harsh, rattling breaths that carried its disgust as clearly as any snarl. Thatcher reached the base of an old oak just as his strength began to fail, its trunk broad and rough beneath his palms, and he hauled himself upward without thinking, boots scraping uselessly against bark until he found a foothold and dragged himself higher, the world narrowing to the ache in his arms and the frantic thud of his heart. He clung there, pressed against the trunk, the branches above him shuddering in the night wind, and looked down just in time to see the creature emerge into the small clearing below, its shape half-lit and fully revealed. Without the coat and hat, it was an assemblage of borrowed parts, hides layered and stretched into a mockery of form, seams puckered and dark, its surface glistening faintly as if perpetually damp, and the sight of it sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through Thatcher that had nothing to do with the pit. The creature circled the tree slowly, craning its head upward, its nostrils or something like them flaring as it took in the smell that surrounded Thatcher, and its reaction was immediate and violent. It recoiled, gagging, one clawed hand lifting as if to shield itself from the offense. Filth, it hissed, the word tearing out of it with raw, unpracticed venom, and Thatcher's mind seized on the sound, on the certainty that disgust, not fear, was the thing that truly repelled it. Desperation sharpened his thoughts into something crude and singular, and he felt a grim resolve settle over him as he shifted his weight, struggling to maintain his grip while his body betrayed him in the most humiliating way imaginable. Warmth spread through his clothes, the sound of liquid striking bark loud in the sudden stillness, and the smell intensified, heavy and unmistakable, flooding the air between them. The creature let out a scream then, high and furious, stumbling back as if struck, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, hands scraping futilely at its own skin as if trying to rid itself of the contamination. 300 years, it shrieked, voice cracking with rage and disbelief. 300 years, and I still cannot tolerate the filth. It retreated another step, then another, its form shuddering violently as it turned away from the tree, the forest itself seeming to recoil with it. I will return, it spat, the promise heavy and unfinished, and then it fled, melting back into the darkness with startling speed, leaving behind only the echo of its fury and the lingering, acrid stench of disgust. Thatcher remained in the tree long after the sounds of its retreat had faded, his muscles trembling, his breath coming in short, sobbing gasps, until the night slowly, cautiously, resumed its ordinary noises, the distant call of an owl, the soft whisper of leaves moving again in the wind. When he finally climbed down, his legs nearly buckled beneath him, and he made his way back to the farmhouse in a daze, stripping off his ruined clothes at the door and scrubbing his skin raw with cold water, as if he could wash away more than just the smell. He survived. That much was undeniable. But survival came with its own quiet price, because from that night on, Thatcher was no longer the man who stayed in the fields after dark or laughed at warnings passed down through generations. Each evening, as the light thinned and the forest edges blurred, he would pause, nose wrinkling, his heart racing at the faintest hint of rot on the wind, and even years later, long after the pit had been filled and the oak cut down, he swore he could still smell it, the filth, the memory, the test he had failed, and barely escaped. An ever-present reminder that some questions are not meant to be answered honestly, and that some things, no matter how long they wait, never forget the ones who revealed themselves to be human in the worst possible way. Thatcher did not sleep that night, not really, not in any way that brought rest, because every time his eyes closed, the forest rose up behind them again, wet and black and breathing, and he would jolt awake with the certainty that something stood just beyond the thin walls of the farmhouse, listening, waiting for the moment when disgust might fade into tolerance. Dawn came, slowly, reluctantly, seeping into the sky like a bruise turning yellow at the edges, and when it did, it revealed a world that looked unchanged, almost insultingly ordinary, frost silvering the ground, smoke lifting lazily from distant chimneys, birds returning to their tentative morning chatter. Thatcher moved through it like a man out of step, his body aching, his skin still prickling with phantom sensations, his nose betraying him by insisting the smell had not fully gone, that it clung somewhere deep and unreachable, embedded not in his clothes or hair but in memory itself. He filled the cesspit later that week, shoveling dirt and lime into it until his arms shook and his back screamed, packing it down with a ferocity that startled the neighbors who watched from a distance and wisely chose not to ask questions. When the hole was gone and the ground leveled, he stood over it for a long time, breathing hard, half expecting the earth to reject the offering, to split open again and reveal what it had briefly held, but it remained stubbornly closed, mute and indifferent. The oak came down next, its trunk sawn through in bitter, methodical strokes, the smell of fresh sap sharp and clean in a way that almost felt like an insult after what had happened beneath its branches. Even as it fell, crashing to the ground with a force that sent birds scattering, Thatcher felt no triumph, only a dull, lingering unease, because he understood now that removing landmarks did not erase what had passed through them. Life resumed around him whether he welcomed it or not. Seasons turned, crops grew and were harvested. Neighbors waved and spoke of ordinary things, and Thatcher answered when spoken to, laughed when expected, but something essential had shifted in him, a hard knot of vigilance that never quite loosened. He stopped staying out late, stopped wandering the tree line with idle curiosity, stopped dismissing the old stories he'd once mocked, and when he heard others tell them half-joking warnings about the woods and what walked there, he said nothing, because he had learned that belief was not something you could argue someone into, only something experience carved into you without asking. The smell followed him through it all, faint but persistent, surfacing at odd moments when there was no possible source for it. A whiff on the evening air as he closed the barn doors, a sour note beneath the scent of rain-soaked soil, the ghost of rot clinging to the cold even in winter. He scrubbed and burned and replaced anything he thought might be carrying it, but the odor returned anyway, uninvited and unmistakable, and over time, Thatcher came to understand that it was not truly a smell at all, but a reminder, a signal that the boundary he had crossed was still aware of him. Years passed, and the memory of that night softened at the edges, blurring just enough for doubt to creep in on quieter days, and it was on one such evening, when the sky hung low and gray and the fields lay still, that Thatcher heard the question again, not spoken aloud but carried on the wind in the same careful, practiced cadence he had never quite forgotten. "Do I look human to you?" He froze where he stood, every muscle locking in place, his breath held painfully in his chest, and for a long moment, nothing else happened at all. Then, the smell thickened, heavy and close, and Thatcher knew with a sick certainty that survival had never meant exemption, that the test was not a single moment, but a condition, one that followed you as long as you continued to exist. He did not answer this time. He shut the door, barred it, and waited in the dark, listening as the forest pressed close and then, slowly, withdrew, leaving behind only silence and the lingering knowledge that some things do not hunt, do not chase, do not need to because they have learned that eventually everyone must be tested again. Thatcher grew old in a way he had never expected, not with the gradual softening people spoke of, but with a tightening, a slow drawing inward as the world narrowed to the things he could control and the things he could not afford to notice for too long. His hair went gray, his hands stiffened, his back bent under the honest weight of years of labor. Yet the vigilance never left him, not even when his body began to fail in quieter, more ordinary ways. He kept his routines strict and predictable, rising before dawn and retreating indoors well before dusk, barring doors that no one else in the valley bothered to lock. And when neighbors joked about his caution, he let them, because fear, he had learned, was easier to endure than regret. The smell remained his constant companion, faint but unmistakable, blooming without warning in moments that should have been harmless during supper, in the stillness before sleep, on bright mornings when the air ought to have been clean, and each time it appeared, it carried with it the same cold understanding. The forest had not forgotten him, and whatever wore the skin of men had not finished its accounting. On the night Thatcher died, the land was quiet again in that particular way he had come to dread, the wind falling away until even the trees seemed to listen, and as he lay alone in his bed, breath shallow and uneven, he became acutely aware of how thin the walls between him and the dark had always been. The smell thickened then, heavier than it had ever been before, filling the room until it eclipsed everything else. And in that suffocating moment, the question came one last time, not from the forest this time, but from somewhere much closer, spoken with a familiarity that chilled him more deeply than any threat ever could. "Do I look human to you?" Thatcher did not laugh. He did not curse. He did not answer at all, because the truth had long since settled into him, heavy and unavoidable. The test had never been about recognizing the monster, but about recognizing himself, about understanding that humanity was not defined by bravery or defiance or honesty, but by frailty, by waste, by the things no creature of myth could ever truly accept. When his breath finally left him, the smell receded, the room falling silent once more, and in the morning, those who came to find him remarked only on how peaceful he looked, how little the end seemed to have troubled him. They buried him at the edge of the property, close to the forest he had learned to respect, and in the years that followed, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes speak of a figure glimpsed among the trees at dusk, draped in a wide coat and hat, standing just far enough away to invite a question. Those who ignored it walked on, never knowing how close they had come to something ancient and patient. Those who answered well, the land kept its own counsel. But if you listen carefully, on nights when the air turns sour and the woods fall silent all at once, you might hear a voice carried on the wind, not angry now, but thoughtful, still practicing, still refining the question it has been asking for 300 years, waiting for the next person foolish enough to believe that survival means you have passed the test. The relic of the mad alchemist, the port town did not announce its secrets loudly. It let them settle into the cracks instead between damp stones along the quay, behind the warped glass of antique shop windows, in the salt-stained ledgers that recorded ships arriving without ever bothering to list those that failed to return. Adrian Rowe had come here for that exact reason. He trusted places that hid their history in layers, that forced you to peel back time slowly rather than offering it up as spectacle. And as he walked the narrow streets beneath flickering gas lamps, the smell of brine and old wood thick in the air, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied the sense of being close to something he was not supposed to find. The auction house was tucked above a shuttered fishmonger, its entrance unmarked save for a brass bell dulled by years of neglect. And when Adrian stepped inside, the sound it made was soft and tired, as though even it were reluctant to draw attention. The room beyond was low-ceilinged and warm, crowded with objects that carried the faint, oppressive weight of having outlived their owners' nautical instruments clouded with corrosion, religious icons stripped of context, bottles of dark glass sealed with wax that had long since lost its elasticity. Adrian moved among them with practiced detachment, his expression politely disinterested, because obsession announced itself too easily in places like this, and he had learned to keep his hunger quiet. When the box finally appeared, it did so without ceremony, brought out by a man who treated it with casual disrespect, setting it down among lesser items as if it were nothing more than another curiosity pulled from a forgotten estate. It was smaller than Adrian had imagined, roughly the size of a hardbound book, its surface dull and pitted, etched with symbols that did not belong to any single tradition he recognized, their lines shallow but precise, as if cut by a hand that valued accuracy over flourish. The room shifted subtly around it, conversations dropping, a half-step in volume, attention bending toward the table despite the absence of any obvious allure, and Adrian felt his pulse quicken despite himself, a telltale sign that something beneath his skepticism had already begun to stir. He waited until the bidding thinned, until the object was dismissed by those seeking more immediately impressive prizes, and claimed it with an amount low enough to avoid notice but high enough to discourage questions. The man at the table wrapped it in oilcloth without comment, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before withdrawing quickly, as if he'd touched something that left a residue he did not care to examine. Back in his rented room overlooking the harbor, Adrian placed the box on the desk and stood over it for a long moment, listening to the distant slap of water against hulls, the muted groan of docked ships settling into the night. He told himself this was just another artifact, another fragment of superstition inflated by time and rumor. And yet when he brushed his fingers across the metal, a chill bloomed outward from the point of contact, sharp and immediate, raising goose flesh along his arms. The latch yielded easily, opening with a soft, unremarkable sound, and Adrian leaned closer, frowning as he peered inside, because the box was empty. No scrolls, no vials, no residue beyond a faint, almost imperceptible sheen along the interior walls. Relief and disappointment tangled briefly in his chest until he realized that the cold had not faded, that it pooled inside the box and spilled outward in slow, deliberate waves, carrying with it a scent so subtle he almost dismissed it at first. Sweet in the way overripe fruit was sweet, cloying and faintly nauseating once it fully registered. He straightened abruptly, the scholar's instinct for caution finally asserting itself, and closed the lid. But the smell lingered, threading itself into the air of the room, settling behind his eyes in a way that made his thoughts feel slightly misaligned. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it did, it carried him into a dream so vivid it left him breathless. A man hunched over a great iron vat, his face obscured by shadow and smoke, feeding strips of flesh into a fire that burned with an unnatural steadiness, his movements reverent rather than frantic. Adrian woke with his heart racing, the sweet scent still clinging faintly to his senses. And as he sat up in the dark, the box resting innocently on the desk across the room, he realized with a cold, creeping certainty that emptiness was not the same as absence, and that whatever had once been sealed inside the relic had not vanished. It had simply learned to wait. Adrian Rowe began to understand that the box did not simply exist in his room, it trained the space around it. The realization came gradually, in ways subtle enough to dismiss at first. The way the air seemed heavier near the desk, even when the window was open. The way his breath caught slightly whenever he crossed that invisible boundary, as if the room itself were holding something back. He kept the relic wrapped and closed, slid into the bottom drawer beneath his notes and correspondence. Yet it asserted itself anyway, bleeding into his routines with quiet insistence. The faint sweetness returned at irregular intervals, never strong enough to locate, only enough to register, settling behind his eyes like a memory he couldn't place, and the cold followed it, a persistent chill that lingered on surfaces long after his hands had left them. Adrian told himself this was psychosomatic, a scholar's mind imposing meaning on coincidence, and threw himself deeper into his work at the archives, tracing the fragmented history of the so-called mad alchemist through shipping records, church censures, and personal journals written in cramped, anxious script. The details were inconsistent, but one thread ran through them all. The alchemist's belief that longing and suffering could be rendered down into a transferable substance, something that could be stored, reapplied, and intensified over time, and always, ting in the margins or footnotes, the same warning appeared in different hands and dialects: what is taken must be replaced. Adrian scoffed at the phrasing, irritated by its vagueness, because warnings that refused specificity felt less like caution and more like superstition dressed up as wisdom. He copied the phrase anyway, underlining it once before closing the ledger and returning to his lodgings with a dull ache settling behind his temples. Lara was waiting for him when he arrived, seated near the window with her notebook open and forgotten, the harbor fog pressing pale and close against the glass behind her. She looked up and smiled, the expression easy and familiar, and Adrian felt the familiar tightening in his chest that accompanied moments he refused to examine too closely. They spoke of ordinary things at first: research, funding, the strange economy of the town, but as they talked, Adrian noticed how her attention drifted repeatedly toward the desk, her gaze snagging there as if something unseen tugged at it. "Is it colder in here than usual?" she asked, rubbing her hands together with a small, embarrassed laugh. Adrian hesitated, then shook his head, the lie sliding out with practiced ease, and moved to pour a drink, the faint sweetness sharpening as he crossed the room. He opened the drawer without fully acknowledging the decision, set the box between them, and framed it as an oddity rather than an obsession, watching carefully as Lara leaned closer, curiosity overtaking caution. When Adrian eased the lid open just enough to let the scent escape, the cold bloomed instantly against his fingers, spreading outward with intimate precision, and Lara inhaled sharply, her posture softening in a way that made his pulse jump. Her pupils dilated slightly, her focus narrowing until it seemed to settle solely on him, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Adrian felt the room tilt, reality recentering itself around his intent rather than his control. He snapped the lid shut, the moment breaking like a thin pane of glass, and Lara blanked, drawing back with a faint frown, as if waking from a shallow dream. She laughed it off, blamed fatigue, and gathered her things to leave, but as she paused in the doorway, she looked at him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "You should be careful with that," she said quietly, not accusatory, just sincere. "Some things don't respond well to curiosity." After she left, Adrian sat alone with the box on the desk, replaying the subtle shifts in her expression, the way her attention had bent toward him without conscious choice, and the realization settled in with sickening clarity. The relic did not act blindly. It responded to desire. It focused itself according to intent. He told himself he would not open it again, that whatever influence it exerted was too unpredictable, too costly to risk. But the thought that followed was colder and far more dangerous if the cost could be managed. That night, the dreams returned with renewed intensity. The alchemist stood closer now, his face partially revealed beneath the hood, eyes bright with manic devotion as he poured a viscous substance from one vessel to another, murmuring calculations under his breath as if reciting prayer. Adrian woke with the sweet scent lingering on his tongue, his hand resting unconsciously on the drawer where the box lay dormant. And by morning, the price of his curiosity announced itself with quiet efficiency. A dock worker he'd spoken with days earlier failed to report for his shift, his absence noted with a shrug and a comment about the sea's appetite. Adrian felt the warning finally land, heavy and undeniable, because he understood now that the relic did not create influence. It redirected it, drawing energy from elsewhere to sustain its effect, and that every time he indulged the temptation to use it, someone who had never agreed to the exchange would pay the balance. Adrian Rowe told himself that intention mattered, that there was a difference between reckless indulgence and careful application, and he clung to that distinction with the kind of fervor usually reserved for faith. He did not open the box again immediately. Instead, he watched the town, watched the way people brushed past one another along the quay, their lives intersecting briefly before diverging again, watched the tide take its slow, methodical breaths against the pilings as if practicing patience. The disappearances, when they occurred, were folded neatly into the town's existing mythology. A sailor who drank too much and missed his footing, a woman who took a late ferry and never arrived, a man rumored to have debts he'd finally decided to outrun, each explanation satisfied on its own. And Adrian hated himself for how easily that satisfaction came once he began to think of loss as a background condition rather than a consequence. When he finally opened the box again, he did so with ritualized restraint, the lid eased back a fraction, the scent released in a thin, controlled ribbon that cooled the air without flooding it. He inhaled once, deliberately, and felt the familiar alignment take hold, a quiet sharpening of focus that made his thoughts feel cleaner, more decisive. He closed the box and washed his hands, scrubbing longer than necessary as if cleanliness might serve as absolution, then went to meet Laura for dinner with a calm that bordered on artificial. The effect was subtle this time, no dilation of pupils, no dreamy lapse, only a gentle easing, a warmth that drew her closer without announcing itself, her laughter lingering a second longer than usual, her gaze returning to him even when the conversation wandered. Adrian catalogued the shifts with professional detachment, noting how the influence responded best when paired with restraint, how excess blunted it rather than intensified it, and the realization that he could calibrate the effect settled over him with dangerous clarity. He justified the next use by telling himself it was necessary to confirm the pattern, that one data point was insufficient, that understanding required repetition, and when the box's scent brushed his senses again, he felt the familiar chill and accepted it with a nod, as though acknowledging a colleague. The next disappearance followed within days. A shopkeeper who had offered Adrian directions when he first arrived, last seen locking up early, her absence marked by a handwritten sign and a muttered speculation about illness. Adrian felt the cost register this time, with less shock and more calculation, an internal ledger balancing influence against loss, and the ease with which he made that mental adjustment frightened him more than the relic itself. He began to plan his interactions with Laura with a careful eye toward timing and proximity, using the box only when he believed the gain justified the unknown expense, and the town obliged him by absorbing the consequences without protest, its appetite for mystery already well fed. With each use, the dreams grew more intricate, the alchemist's instructions more explicit, the calculations he murmured resolving into something Adrian could almost follow, ratios and substitutions sketched in smoke and shadow. What is taken must be replaced, the alchemist repeated, no longer as warning but as principle. And Adrian woke each morning with the uneasy sense that he was being trained, his moral hesitation sanded down into something smooth and workable. He told himself he was still in control, that the box responded to his choices rather than dictating them. And yet, he found his days increasingly structured around opportunity, his nights spent replaying interactions to assess whether the influence had been sufficient or whether another application would be required. When Laura finally reached for him first, her hand finding his with an unguarded familiarity that made his breath hitch, Adrian felt a surge of triumph so sharp it nearly drowned out the quiet tallying that followed, the awareness that somewhere in the town another absence was already forming. He did not ask who would pay this time. He did not need to. The arithmetic had become intuitive, and that, more than the relic's power, marked the moment when Adrian crossed from curiosity into commitment, accepting the logic of exchange as a natural law rather than a moral failure. The invitation arrived printed on thick cream paper, tasteful and unassuming, announcing a small reception at the Harborside Museum to celebrate a recent acquisition, an excuse, really, for donors and scholars to gather in a room that smelled faintly of varnish and old stone, where wine would flow and conversations would overlap just enough to feel intimate without becoming honest. Adrian accepted without hesitation, already feeling the shape of the evening arrange itself around him, because events like this created a density of attention the box seemed to prefer, a convergence of longing and ambition that made its influence easier to distribute. He prepared with the same care he once reserved for field work, opening the drawer and studying the relic as if it might object to what he had in mind, then shaving a hair-thin curl from one interior edge with a jeweler's file, the metal yielding with a soft, obedient scrape that sent a sharper sweetness blooming into the room. The scent clung to him as he dressed, subtle but insistent, and by the time he stepped into the museum's warm light, he felt aligned in a way that made hesitation seem unnecessary. Lara found him near the back of the room, her smile immediate and unguarded, and as they spoke, Adrian sensed the relic's reach extending beyond her, touching others in small, imperceptible ways, the way conversation stalled when he entered a circle, the way eyes lingered too long before snapping away, the way the air itself seemed to thrum with a low, expectant tension. He inhaled once, quietly, and felt the alignment deepen, the sweetness sharpening into something almost metallic, and the room responded, as if a signal had been given. It began subtly. A donor swayed and steadied himself against a column. A curator paused mid-sentence, brow furrowing as if searching for a word that had slipped just out of reach. Then the shift spread, attention snapping toward Adrian in uneven bursts, faces turning with the same hollow focus he had seen in Lara's eyes before, pupils dilated, expressions emptied of context. Someone laughed, too loud and too late, and the sound fractured the room's fragile equilibrium, sending a ripple of movement through the crowd as people stepped closer without realizing they were doing it. Adrian's triumph curdled into alarm as he recognized the change in scale, the way the influence no longer narrowed itself to a single thread but radiated outward, demanding more than he had ever offered before. The sweetness thickened until it coated his tongue, and with it came a sudden, overwhelming sense of pressure, as if the box still hidden, still closed, were vibrating with anticipation, counting, not minutes or moments, but bodies. Lara reached for him, her grip tight and urgent, her voice lost beneath the rising murmur as others pressed in, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt less like desire and more like hunger. Panic surged, cold and clarifying, and Adrian understood at last that the arithmetic had shifted beyond his control, that the relic had accepted his calibrations as permission to escalate. He tried to step back, to break the line of sight, but the crowd closed the gap with unsettling efficiency, hands brushing his sleeves, his shoulders, his throat, each touch siphoning something from him that left him weaker with every second. The box's presence roared in his ears now, a low, satisfied vibration that drowned out thought, and in that noise, he finally grasped the alchemist's true intent. The relic was not designed to grant influence indefinitely. It was designed to complete a distillation, to convert accumulated longing into a stable essence, and the final reagent was not suffering taken from others, but the will of the one who believed himself the master of the exchange. As the room surged and collapsed inward, Adrian's vision tunneling as the sweetness turned cloying and thick, he felt the last of his control slip away, replaced by a terrible clarity. He had never been the operator of the box. He had been the vessel it was filling. They never agreed on what happened in that room, not afterward, not even years later when the museum's records were quietly amended and the event was referred to, vaguely, as an incident of collective panic brought on by spoiled wine and bad ventilation. Witnesses remembered fragments that refused to align, the way the light seemed too bright and then not bright enough, the pressure in their chests, the taste at the back of the throat, sweet, metallic, impossible to place. Some recalled Adrian Rowe standing at the center of it all, pale and strangely calm, as if he had already stepped past fear into something colder, while others insisted he was dragged under by the crowd, pulled down in a blur of hands and voices that rose and fell like surf. What they agreed on was the end, the sudden collapse of motion, the way people staggered back as if released from a held breath, and the sight of Adrian lying on the stone floor, eyes open, to expression slack with a peace that did not belong to sleep. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, only a thin sheen of condensation on the tiles around him, cool to the touch, and a scent that dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a faint nausea that lingered for days. The box was found nearby, its lid closed, its surface warm in a way metal should not be, vibrating faintly as if it were settling after a long journey. Lara was the one who picked it up. She did so without hesitation, cradling it against her body with a familiarity that startled those watching, her face composed, her eyes distant but satisfied, as though a tension she had never named had finally been resolved. When someone asked if she was all right, she smiled and nodded, and the question slipped away, unpursued, because there are moments when concern recognizes its own futility. In the weeks that followed, the town absorbed the loss the way it always had, folding it into rumor and routine, letting the sea shoulder part of the blame. Lara resigned from her post at the university and took a position that kept her close to the artifacts she once studied from a distance, becoming, in time, the unofficial custodian of a private collection whose provenance was deliberately vague. The box remained with her, displayed rarely and never opened, its presence enough to quiet a room, its surface dulled by careful handling. Those who stood near it for too long reported a sense of completion they could not explain, a fullness that asked nothing of them and yet left them strangely hollow afterward. Somewhere beneath the harbor, currents shifted and settled, carrying away whatever traces remained of Adrian Rowe's will, rendered down and sealed away at last. And in the dark, when the box was alone, it whispered not loudly, not urgently, but with the patient confidence of something that had achieved its purpose. It promised nothing so crude as power. It offered permanence. It offered relief from wanting. And it waited, content in the knowledge that there would always be another pair of hands willing to mistake emptiness for potential, another mind ready to believe that mastery could be separated from cost. The reversal of the pure heart. Brother Julian returned to the monastery at dawn, when the mountains still held their breath and the light crept slowly across the snow like something uncertain it was allowed to exist. The bells had not rung to announce his arrival. They rarely did for those who returned from seclusion, as if the stone walls themselves understood that whatever emerged from solitude should not be welcomed too loudly, lest it forget what it had learned in silence. Julian walked the final stretch of the path alone, his boots crunching softly against frost-hardened gravel, the air thin and sharp in his lungs, carrying the faint resinous scent of pine and cold stone. 3 years he had spent in isolation among the upper ridges, fasting, praying, learning to listen past his own thoughts. And now that he had returned, the absence of sound felt wrong, not peaceful, but strained, as if the mountain were suppressing something that wished very much to speak. The monastery rose from the rock like an afterthought, its walls weathered and pale, its windows dark despite the early hour, and Julian slowed instinctively, his hand tightening around the worn cord at his waist as a subtle unease settled into his chest. He had expected stillness. He had not expected resistance. Inside, the corridors were cold and dim, lit only by narrow slits of mountain light that fell across the stone floor in thin, uneven bands. And with each step, Julian felt a pressure build behind his eyes, a sensation he recognized immediately, not fear, but disturbance. The echo of prayers interrupted and left unfinished. The air carried a faint sweetness beneath the incense, wrong in its warmth, clinging to the back of his throat in a way that made his breath hitch, and Julian stopped, closing his eyes, centering himself as he had been taught. Observe, Do not judge. Feel, but do not answer. When he opened his eyes again, the monastery felt no less altered, but his purpose sharpened, cutting cleanly through the unease. He moved deeper into the halls, past the refectory where bowls lay untouched, past the chapel where candles burned low and uneven, their flames trembling as if stirred by a breath no one else could feel. It was near the lower levels, where the old crypts and storage chambers carved into the mountain had long been sealed off from daily use, that he found the first sign of what had gone wrong. The stone door stood ajar, its heavy bolt retracted with deliberate care, and the smell there was stronger, the same sickly sweetness, layered over iron and damp earth, a scent Julian had encountered only once before in forbidden texts he had been warned never to read. He stepped inside without hesitation, his presence steady, his mind clear, and the darkness greeted him not as emptiness, but as something occupied. Symbols had been etched into the walls, shallow but precise, their lines still dark with fresh residue, and at the center of the chamber lay a circle of dried blood, its edges carefully maintained, its purpose unmistakable. Julian knelt beside it, fingers hovering just above the stone, and felt the echo of intent ripple outward, a hunger that had not yet been satisfied. This was not curiosity gone astray. This was devotion twisted into appetite. Footsteps echoed faintly above him, hurried and uneven, and Julian rose, his expression calm but resolute, because he understood now that the threat was not an external force pressing in from the wilderness, but something that had already taken root within the walls sworn to keep it out. As he made his way back toward the upper levels, the mountain groaned softly around him, a deep, resonant sound that felt less like shifting stone and more like a warning, and Julian accepted it without flinching, because he knew that purity did not mean untouched, it meant unchanged, and whatever had begun here would test that distinction to its breaking point. Brother Julian did not call the bells. He did not gather the remaining monks into the chapel or raise his voice to demand answers, because the kind of corruption he felt moving through the monastery would not reveal itself under scrutiny, it would only learn how to hide better. Instead, he walked the halls as he always had, his pace unhurried, his presence unremarkable, letting the rhythms of the place speak to him in their own fractured language. It did not take long for the patterns to emerge. Doors that should have been open remained shut well past morning prayers. Candles burned down unevenly, their wax pooled and hardened as if no one had bothered to tend them. In the refectory, the bread was untouched, yet water had been drawn repeatedly through the night, leaving the stone basin damp and streaked, as though thirst, not hunger, had driven the unseen activity below. Julian passed brothers he had known for years and felt the subtle dissonance immediately, the way their eyes slid past him rather than meeting his gaze, the way their prayers stumbled over familiar words, syllables softened or stretched as if reshaped by private emphasis. This was not possession. It was erosion. The mountain itself seemed to feel it, a low vibration passing through the stone floors, too gentle to register as sound, but persistent enough to unsettle the breath. Julian followed the disturbance downward, past the sealed stair that led to the catacombs, its warning sigils scraped partially away, not vandalized in haste, but worn down through repeated contact. Someone had been here many times, patient and methodical, and the realization settled into Julian with quiet dread. Whatever had begun in secrecy was now habitual. In the lower chambers, he found them not all at once, but in fragments. A novice, kneeling alone in a storage alcove, his hands stained dark to the wrist, whispering prayers that bent inward, asking not for guidance, but for permission. Another brother pacing the corridor, muttering fragments of scripture that no longer aligned, his voice hollow, his breath carrying that same sickly sweetness Julian had sensed earlier, stronger now, unmistakable. When Julian spoke to them, gently at first, their reactions were immediate and telling not fear, not guilt, but relief, as if being seen at last had loosened something tight and painful inside them. They spoke in halting confessions of promises made in dreams, of a presence that listened without judgment, that offered certainty in place of doubt, strength where faith had wavered. They had not set out to betray their vows, they insisted. They had only wanted to be useful, to matter in a world where prayer alone felt increasingly inadequate. Julian listened without interruption, absorbing their words and the deeper truth beneath them, because he recognized the mechanism at work. The corruption did not begin with hunger or ambition, but with compassion twisted into urgency, the belief that doing more, even wrongly, was preferable to doing nothing at all. The disappearances came next, mentioned in whispers, avoided in open speech, brothers assigned to night vigils who never returned, novices sent to gather water from the lower springs who were simply not there anymore. Julian traced the pattern through the monastery's old records and found the missing pages, carefully removed, the absences aligned with nights when the mountain air had turned unnaturally still. And always, beneath it all, the scent lingered sweet, cloying, intimate, strongest near the sealed passages where the stone itself seemed to sweat. It was there, deep in the catacombs, that Julian finally felt the presence watching him directly, not with hostility, but with expectation, as if his return from seclusion had been anticipated and prepared for. A voice brushed the edges of his thoughts, then, not loud enough to be heard, but clear all the same, offering understanding rather than threat, suggesting that purity was not immunity, that even the most disciplined heart could serve a higher purpose if it were willing to bend. Julian steadied himself, breathing slowly, anchoring his mind in the practices that had sustained him through years of solitude, and in that stillness, he identified the truth that chilled him more deeply than any warning could have. The corruption was not confined to a single mind or ritual. It was contagious, spreading through shared doubt and unspoken longing, and somewhere beneath the monastery, someone had learned how to cultivate it deliberately. When Julian finally spoke aloud, his voice carried cleanly through the stone corridors, calm and unwavering, calling one name only, Brother Damien, and the mountain answered him with a low, distant groan, as if acknowledging that the hunt had truly begun. Brother Damien did not flee when Julian called his name. He did not hide among the novices or retreat deeper into the mountain like a hunted animal, because the man Julian found waiting in the lower passageway had already accepted that concealment was no longer necessary. Damien stood beneath a low arch of stone, his robe stained dark at the hem, his posture calm, almost relieved, as though the long tension of secrecy had finally loosened its grip. The lantern at his side cast uneven light across his face, and Julian was struck immediately by how little it had changed. The familiar kindness remained there, the gentleness that had once made Damien a comfort to those who struggled, but it had been rearranged somehow, hollowed and repurposed into something that watched rather than welcomed. "You came back stronger than I expected," Damien said quietly, his voice steady, lacking both mockery and apology, and Julian felt the weight of the words settle into him with unsettling precision. He did not respond at once. He took in the space instead, the faint symbols carved into the stone behind Damien, the subtle way the air curved inward toward him, the smell that clung not just to the walls now but to the man himself, sweet and metallic, intimate in a way that suggested prolonged communion. When Julian finally spoke, it was not to accuse, but to ask, because he needed to understand the shape of the fall before he could confront it. Damien smiled faintly at that, a gesture so familiar it tightened Julian's chest, and began to speak as they walked deeper into the mountain together, past chambers long abandoned and tunnels that pulsed faintly with borrowed energy. He spoke of doubt first, of the quiet despair that crept in during prayer when answers did not come, of the ache of watching others suffer while faith demanded patience instead of action. He spoke of the presence that had found him there, in that vulnerability, offering not dominion or indulgence, but clarity, a voice that did not command but listened, that reflected his own questions back to him, sharpened and undeniable. "It showed me what we are," Damien said, gesturing to the dark ahead, "and what we could be if we stopped pretending that restraint was the same as righteousness." Julian felt the tug of the words, the careful way they were framed to align with compassion rather than ambition, and he understood then why the corruption spread, as it did not by force, but by resonance, each doubt answered by a promise tailored precisely to its shape. They reached the cavern at last, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor carved into concentric patterns that glistened faintly with fresh residue, and at the center stood the channel Damien had built, a lattice of symbols and offerings arranged not to summon something outward, but to invite it inward. The air here was unnaturally still, sound dampened as if absorbed by an unseen mass, and Julian felt the pressure behind his eyes intensify, the sense of being observed deepening into something more personal. Damien turned to face him then, his expression earnest, almost hopeful. "It wants you," he said simply. And in that moment, the cavern seemed to lean closer, the darkness thickening until it felt almost tactile. Not your obedience, not your body, your purity. With it, this ends. The suffering, the waiting, the endless erosion. You could give it what it needs and save everyone it has taken. The offer landed not as temptation, but as burden, and Julian felt the full weight of it settle into his chest, the recognition that this was the true inversion at work, the use of virtue itself as currency. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in the discipline that had carried him through isolation, and when he opened them again, the light within him did not flare or dazzle. It steadied, clean, and unwavering. "You mistake surrender for sacrifice," Julian said quietly, stepping forward, and the words seemed to carve space around them. He raised his hand, not in violence, but in invocation, and the pure light he drew forth did not burn. It clarified, stripping away the borrowed shapes clinging to Damien's spirit, revealing the fear and hunger beneath. Damien cried out as the light took hold, not in pain but in grief, collapsing to his knees as the corruption recoiled, and for a moment, Julian believed the confrontation had ended. Then the cavern answered. The channel Damien had opened flaring with cold intensity, and Julian felt the presence behind it shift from observer to participant, its attention fixing on him with unmistakable interest. Because the purification had not closed the door, it had only proven that the door could be opened wider than ever before. The purification did not end the cavern's breath. It altered it. Where the borrowed energies had recoiled from Julian's light, they did not disperse. They folded inward, condensing into a pressure that pressed against the senses like a held note that refused to resolve. Damien lay motionless at Julian's feet, his chest rising, falling in shallow, uneven intervals. The worst of the corruption stripped away, but the imprint of it still etched deep, a reminder that cleansing was not the same as undoing. Julian knelt beside him briefly, confirming what he already knew, that Damien would live, and that living would be its own penance, but the act drew his attention back to the channel at the cavern's heart, where the lattice of symbols had begun to glow with a cold, inward light. It was not brightness in any human sense. It was absence made visible, a thinning of the world where something had learned how to lean through. The mountain reacted first, stone groaning softly as if adjusting to a new weight, the air growing so still that Julian could hear his own pulse with painful clarity. He rose slowly, every instinct urging caution, because the presence now pressing against the threshold did not announce itself with malice or hunger. It waited, patient and vast, a gravity that did not need to pull to be felt. Julian understood then that the entity Damien had called the Void Keeper was not a creature that entered space, but a condition that space itself could be persuaded to adopt, a promise of quiet so complete it threatened to erase distinction altogether. The pressure increased, and with it came the whisper, not spoken aloud but shaped directly into intention, offering a simple resolution: yield what you are, and what has been taken will be returned. Images pressed at the edges of Julian's mind, brothers lost to the dark, novices whose faith had frayed under doubt, futures sealed and reopened as easily as doors, and the temptation was not power, but restoration, the chance to make the ledger balance at last. He felt the purity he had cultivated strain under the weight of that appeal, because it did not ask him to abandon compassion, only to weaponize it, to become a conduit through which suffering could be traded for silence. Julian stepped closer to the channel, the cold biting deeper with each pace, and raised his hands, palms outward, grounding himself in breath and posture, in the disciplines that had taught him how to endure without grasping. The light he drew forth now was not an expansion, not a flare meant to dominate or destroy. It was a boundary, deliberate and exact, shaped by refusal rather than aggression. The void pressed harder, testing the edge of that boundary, and Julian felt his strength begin to bleed away, the effort demanding more than his body wished to give. He did not resist the pain. He accepted it as proof that he was still present, still distinct, and redirected what remained of his energy outward, tracing a perimeter not around the entity itself, but around the space that allowed it purchase. The effect was immediate and catastrophic in its restraint. The channel collapsed inward, not violently, but decisively, the symbols dulling and cracking as the mountain reclaimed them, the absence forced into a shape it could not expand beyond. Julian staggered, vision blurring as the cost of the act registered fully, a searing emptiness spreading through his limbs, his breath tearing free in ragged gasps. But he held the boundary all the same, anchoring it not in his will alone, but in the monastery above, in the faith embedded in its stones and rituals, in the collective memory of restraint that had once defined the place. The Void Keeper receded, not banished, not destroyed, but contained, its presence reduced to a pressure that pressed back from the other side of a newly drawn line. The cavern fell silent then, a silence so complete it rang, and Julian sank to one knee, his strength spent, understanding at last the truth Huyen Tan had glimpsed centuries before. Some evils could not be ended without becoming something worse, and the only victory left was to hold the door closed, knowing it would never truly lock. Julian did not remember leaving the cavern. He remembered only the sensation of weight redistributing itself, as if the mountain had shifted just enough to make room for a burden it no longer wished to carry alone. When awareness returned, it did so in fragments, the scrape of stone against stone, voices speaking his name with careful restraint, hands steadying his shoulders while avoiding his face. He opened his eyes to a world drained of detail, light reduced to a uniform, painful brightness that offered no edges to rest on, and he understood before anyone spoke that something essential had changed. The brothers gathered around him moved like silhouettes now, their features smoothed into indistinction, yet he could feel them more clearly than ever, their fear and relief pressing against him in equal measure. Damien was among them, standing apart, his presence marked by a hollow ache that resonated faintly with the boundary Julian had forged below, a reminder that redemption, when it came, did not arrive whole. They told Julian what he already knew. The channel had sealed, the lower passages fallen quiet, the sickly sweetness burned away until only cold stone and incense remained. What they did not say, but did not need to, was that the quiet felt provisional, a pause rather than an ending. Julian rose with assistance, his body protesting the movement, his vision offering nothing but pale uniformity, and felt the boundary respond to him even here, a subtle pressure that tightened whenever he moved too far from its center. The realization settled into him with slow, devastating clarity. The barrier was no longer anchored solely to place. It was anchored to him. He spent the following weeks learning the limits of that truth. Each attempt to leave the monastery grounds brought a tightening behind his eyes, a pull that drew him back toward the mountain like a tide answering its source. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the sensation of standing before a door that did not exist. His presence alone, the thing that kept it closed. The brothers adapted around him with quiet efficiency, restructuring their lives to accommodate a role no one spoke of openly, because naming it would have made it permanent. They brought him food, read to him, described the changing seasons in careful detail, but Julian listened with a distant calm, his attention always divided, a part of him fixed on the pressure beneath the stone, measuring it, responding to its fluctuations with adjustments so subtle they felt like instinct rather than effort. Over time, the monastery's rituals changed as well, prayers shaped not toward victory or salvation, but toward maintenance, a collective acknowledgement that vigilance, not triumph, was the truest expression of faith left to them. Julian accepted his confinement without bitterness, because he understood now that sacrifice was not the act of dying for a cause, but the act of remaining, day after day, bearing witness to a danger that would never grant the relief of resolution. His eyes, they said, were entirely white now, unmarked by pupil or iris, a visible testament to the energy that had burned through him and left clarity in its wake. And yet when people spoke to him, they felt seen in a way that unsettled and comforted them in equal measure. Years passed, The world beyond the mountains shifted and redefined itself, while Julian remained, aging slowly, his body bearing the quiet toll of unceasing vigilance. Travelers sometimes reached the monastery seeking answers to questions they could not articulate, and when they stood before Julian, they felt the weight of something vast held carefully at bay, a presence defined not by menace, but by restraint. He never warned them directly. He never spoke of the Void Keeper by name. He simply listened, and in that listening, many chose to turn back, their questions softened into something survivable. On the night Julian finally understood that his strength would one day fail, he did not despair. He sat in the chapel, hands folded, breath steady, and felt the boundary settle into a shape that no longer depended entirely on him, the result of decades of careful reinforcement woven into the mountain's memory. When dawn came, the bells rang softly for the first time in many years, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, and Julian remained where he was, neither victorious nor defeated, but transformed into something rarer and more enduring, the one who keeps the door, knowing that some evils are not meant to be conquered, only held apart from the world by those willing to live in the space between salvation and silence. The night has a way of closing in quietly, not with a door slamming shut, but with the sense that something has finished listening, if you're still awake. Thank you for staying. You've heard stories about paths that should not be blocked, steps that should not be counted, faces that should not be turned, questions that should not be answered, objects that should not be owned, and sacrifices that do not end when the danger does. None of these stories asked you to believe in them. They only asked you to notice how easily things change, when attention is given where it doesn't belong. As you go back to your own quiet, your hallway, your road, your room, your thoughts, pay attention to the small details, the way silence holds its breath, the way certain places feel occupied. Lock your doors if it helps. Leave a light on if you need to. Or don't. Some things don't care either way. This has been a midnight broadcast. And wherever you are now, whether you're drifting toward sleep or staring into the dark, remember, not every test looks like danger. Not every survivor escapes. And some doors are kept closed, only because someone, somewhere, is still standing on the other side. Good night.